What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, it can. Let me check. Maybe we can just apply, looking at the program of the house, just
Yeah,
apply for them to be late in the house or something like that. I don't know.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. Then they can make it like a working lunch from two, I
Yeah.
mean, from like 1 to 2, meet those people and just have lunch or,
Okay,
something
maybe
to.
let's look at Thursday. After caucus, right? After caucus, 12:30, probably until 2:30 or 3 o'clock.
Yeah,
But
we can do that.
but I'll check with you, Babalo, if he does not have a meeting Thursday, then
Okay.
we'll take it from there. Sure.
Okay, sure. Okay. Let me know, man.
Okay, buddy. Sure.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Bye.
Mr. Machon. Hello, Mr. Machon.
Yebo, yebo baba.
Kunjani baba?
Yebo njani?
I'm good. I see you have two gadgets here.
No,
I do not advise that because when you want to speak, it's gonna cause an echo on your
no,
side.
no, no. Bese ngayitholi ngala ku-app.
Okay, okay,
So ku-tablet I mean. So ke
okay,
ngizovula
okay. Sure, sure, Mr. Machon.
sure, sure.
Recording in progress. Good morning, honorable members, support team, Honorable Ndlovu, Chairperson
Good
Select
morning,
Committee.
Doctor.
Good morning. Secretariat, do we have enough members of the two committees so that we can start with the meeting?
From the Standing Committee on Finance, yes, Chair.
From the Select on Finance Chair, yes, we have enough members.
Okay. The meeting is officially open. I would like to welcome the chairperson of the Select Committee, Honorable Ndlovu. Welcome members of standing and select committees, respectively. Welcome the support teams of the two committees from the NCOP and NA. Welcome the media in attendance and PBO and other entities. I'm not sure if FFC is here, National Treasury, SARS. You are all welcome. Do we have apologies?
None received from Standing Committee on Finance, Chair.
From the Select on Finance Chair, only Honorable Lehwase will be joining us late. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Alan, I saw a WhatsApp from Honorable Lekhanyane apologizing, saying that is deployed to attend Commonwealth Conference representing Parliament in Australia. So let's record that apology.
Will do, Chair.
Okay. Let's move to item 2. The purpose of today's meeting is for stakeholders to make submissions on the 2024 revised fiscal framework and revenue proposals. Honorable Ndlovu, in case I have a problem with connectivity, please take over.
Okay, Doctor. Noted.
Thanks very much. Let's move to 2.1. Comrade Matthew, all stakeholders are allocated 15 minutes. Comrade Matthew, over to you.
Okay, morning, Chair, morning, members and colleagues. Yeah, thanks for giving us, as COSATU, just a chance to share our input. We just uploaded very quickly. Thanks, Chair. And look, Chair, I think we appreciate this is not a new budget speech. It's a midterm reflection, but I think we still viewed or felt that government should have done much more, given the challenges we're facing as a country. We really hope, Chair, to see a much more bold and decisive MTBS, which is going to help grow the economy, to rebuild the state, to slash unemployment, and also to accelerate the fight against crime and corruption. For us, we felt, Chair, quite disappointed as Labour and COSATU, because we felt it's really a business as usual approach, with few new measures, despite an economy that continues to struggle along. And I think we should appreciate, Chair, that the patience of society is not limitless. We saw during the elections recently, and it's critical to give hope to a population which is quite despondent. And government, we think, needs to be seen to be driving the economy and to be delivering. So we really felt it was an underwhelming budget statement. And of course, the one kind of message you get out of it is a fixation on slashing the wage bill, which workers fear will leave them deeper in debt and having to cover filling rising number of vacancies across the state. So we think it's important to bear in mind that unemployment has risen for the past 3 quarters. It's at 42.6%. Youth unemployment is 70%, and we think that should be our number one focal point. If you look at the MTBF, it projects a 1.7% growth over the next 3 to 4 years, and that's not going to produce enough jobs even to absorb new labour market entrants. We're seeing entrenched levels of poverty and inequality, obviously. the AG reports on the number of dysfunctional municipalities who are struggling to provide basic services are deeply alarming. We're seeing many public services which society depends upon, the economy needs, are struggling, overwhelmed by vacancies. Many of our SOEs are really embattled, and there's an urgent need for further support around our railway network and our ports in particular. And of course, our crime and corruption levels are endemic, and we've seen our infrastructure is really aging on many fronts. Chair, I think on the fiscal framework, we really do disagree fundamentally with Treasury on the approach that above all else, we must be slashing expenditure and debt. We take a different viewpoint that we need to be stimulating growth, enabling businesses, creating jobs, rebuilding the capacity of the state, including our SOEs, to deliver the services that society, that the economy require. You know, these are not luxuries, these are absolute requirements if you want to grow the economy. And if we assume that the MTEF 1.7% GDP growth over the next 3 to 4 years actually happens, that means we're accepting an unemployment rate of over 40%. And we don't think any society can sustain that level of unemployment. We've seen cutting expenditure repeatedly, and it has not achieved anything. We've got very little results to show for it. And, you know, we're not saying that we should just go and print money and spend recklessly. We appreciate the need to manage the debt, but we think we need to look at internationally other countries who've gone through similar difficulties, whether it's the US, the European Union, whether it's China. The major industrial nations have embarked when the economy is struggling, have opted to stimulate the economy. And we think the fundamental and most sustainable path, really, if you want to manage the debt, is to grow the economy, is to create jobs, because that generates the taxes the state requires, not only to fund public services, but also to reduce the debt as well. Chair, look, it's always natural for a lot of discussion to be around the wage bill, but we think it's important to demystify a lot of the arguments. So some people would say the public sector is bloated, too many bodies. In '94, we had 34 million South Africans, just over 1 million public servants. Today, we've nearly doubled in population to 64 million, yet the public service headcount has not really increased that much. It's about 1.2, 1.3 million, but that includes about 70,000 unfilled vacancies at any given point. And what we've seen is that the ratio of public servants to population has increased. You know, we're having a rising ratio of teachers to learners, of nurses to patients. We've seen the impact of vacancies in home affairs. We've seen the police headcount decline by 15% over the past decade. Others will say, okay, it's fine, it's the wage bill which is a problem. But in 2008, yes, the wage bill increased because government took the decision to fill critical skilled vacancies like nurses and doctors and so forth, teachers, police. Since that time, it was still about 35% of the budget for 15 years, not changing much. But what we've seen in the last 2 years with budget cuts is that it's declined in essence by about 10%, so from 35 to 31%. And Chair, we've also seen in 2020 a wage freeze, below inflation increases since that time. And one can continue on that path, but one must also understand what is the consequence. And the consequence will be that your public service skilled professionals will simply leave to better paying, less stressful jobs in the private sector overseas. People often want to compare apples to oranges and say, well, public sector, it pays better than private sector. Public sector doesn't employ farm workers or domestic workers who are paid slave wages in the private sector. We need to compare what a teacher earns in the public sector or what a doctor earns in the public sector versus the private sector, and you'll find inevitably they fall behind. But I think the point I want to make is that we do need skills and warm bodies to deliver public services. And we really hoped that we would have seen a solution to the pending 2,400 teachers in the Western Cape whose jobs are at risk, and possibly other problems that down the road in the budget statement. Our proposals here is that on the early retirement package, government should go to the PSABC. Let's see what engagements can take place. Let's see how we can avoid a loss of critical skills for the state. We should be prioritizing frontline vacancies to be filled, and also resolving the Western Cape teaching issue, which will happen in other provinces too, if we're not careful. But we do need a roadmap to modernize, to rebuild frontline public services, because there is a return on investment. You know, an efficient home affairs which doesn't keep workers queuing for 6 days to get ID documents means those workers don't lose 6 days of wages, means those companies are not disrupted and so forth. And that, you know, a principle applies to hospitals, to roads, police, etc. If you want to reduce the headcount, let's start with the cabinet, for example. We speak of bloated parts of the state, then yes, we can surely do without 43 deputy ministers. Chair, on the SOEs, we really do want to commend the excellent turnaround by Eskom overcoming load shedding. That's, government has done excellent work in the past year and a half and was commended. We think Eskom does remain fragile, Chair, and we need to continue to give us support to plug financial leakages, loopholes, corruption, especially the rising size of municipal debt owed to Eskom. We can't afford for Eskom to continue to be dependent upon double-digit tariff hikes, because that, again, has a suffocating effect on businesses, on workers, the economy, etc. Transit 2, we think, remains our #1 crisis. Transit today transports less good than it did 30 years ago, yet the economy has doubled. So again, we need to give support to stabilize freight rail, to modernize our ports, because that's key to mining, to manufacturing, to agricultural sectors, which are major sources of jobs, where jobs are under threat. And of course, they also generate real revenue for the state. And similarly, Metro Rail has done good work. But if we can make sure it's fully operational, that helps 10 million commuters get to work on time at a far cheaper price. It boosts workplace productivity and so forth. But if you also give Transit and Metro Rail support, you help protect food and commuters from inflation, from international oil price too. And again, there's a need for similar support as we gave to Eskom, dealing with cable theft, modernizing the IT systems, investing in infrastructure, etc. We had been disappointed, Chair, that there wasn't turnaround plans that we can see really around Denel, the post office and post bank. And in fact, Chair, it's quite alarming that in the budget, commitment was made for about 3.4 billion rand, if I get my numbers right, to the post office. And that money has not been dispensed yet to the post office. And if it's not given to the post office by this month, as per the court agreement, the business rescue practitioners will then move to liquidate the post office. And it's quite alarming that tragedy has been silent on that issue, Chair. So our proposals here, Chair, really is let's continue to give support to Eskom, especially on the infrastructure rollout, and similarly to Transnet and to Metro Rail as well, because those two alone can add about 2% to the GDP. Similarly for Metro Rail, and of course to a lesser extent, but equally important to now, post office, post bank too. But we need an alternative besides simply retrenching workers or allowing these institutions to pickpocket those workers, the pension funds, etc. We've spoken quite a bit, Chair, about reducing the fuel price, and the President made that commitment. And one key component to that is to address the crisis in the road accident fund. And a pathway to doing that is for the Department of Transport to table the RAF and RAPS bills at Parliament, so that it ensures its monies goes towards low-income claimants and not to road accident lawyers. But we mention it, Chair, because about 3 rand for every litre of petrol goes towards the RAF. Chair, I think the local government front is really quite distressing. We are seeing a rapid deterioration, but we're not seeing real headway by government to turn things around. But we're seeing the indicators just getting worse each time. It's now about 3 dozen municipalities which struggle to pay staff in about 6 provinces. And we've seen with the 2-part pension reforms, quite a few municipalities, even in the Western Cape, which had never struggled to pay staff, defaulting on paying workers' pension funds. So, Chair, government has put in place a really progressive infrastructure rollout program of about 943 billion rand. And obviously a key chunk of that goes to municipalities. We are not going to spend it, and we're going to see rollovers come February, unless we make sure the municipalities are fully capacitated. But again, if we don't do it, Chair, what we see is, like we saw with Clover, plants, factories being closed and workers being retrenched and communities plunged into poverty. So we need some sort of discussion about how to move towards a district development model. What is a sustainable financial path? Again, the Eskom issue, we can't have Eskom bailing out municipalities. And of course, we do think Parliament, especially the NCP, needs to be much more aggressive in the 7th term to really hold the municipality to account, because the indicators are extremely alarming. And we're just fearing or witnessing the death of municipalities in some instances. The department's chair, we are really seeing departments struggling to cope with declining budgets, fees and posts, the brain drain, aging infrastructure. And again, Home Affairs is a walking advertisement. But we do want to welcome the additional funds, for SARS, for Home Affairs, for Justice, SAPS, the SANLAW debt relief, and so on, quite a few other ones, the SOD grant adjustment and so forth, the disaster relief funding. But there was quite a few departments, Chair, and we'll get into more in the preparations hearings, which have failed to meet the targets at an alarming rate, whether it's health or cognitive, whether it's water or basic education infrastructure, SAPS, NPA, DMRE, and that's quite alarming because you give money to departments and they don't spend it, or they don't even come close to meeting the targets. So we do think there's a need for Parliament to be much more strict with these departments. And again, we need to have some roadmaps to at least prioritize and modernize some of our frontline public services, whether it's education or health, home affairs, police, etc. Just checking towards the end, which is economic and social relief. Again, we think if we can make sure the infrastructure funds are spent, that is a stimulus to the economy. We do need to have a discussion about, is there a possibility for a new loan guarantee stimulus type support for SMEs, private and publicly and privately funded. We should really have a much more bold imagination approach towards industrial financing. The amount of money we give there is quite limited. We think there is a need for some sort of roadmap for the SOD grant to reach the food poverty line. It is a BIG in foundation and to link its participants to skills and employment opportunities. And the presidential employment stimulus had done quite well to enable 500,000 young people become teaching assistants, give them the skills and experience needed to find permanent jobs, earn a minimum wage. And that program, Chair, has been cut from 36 billion rand to 3 billion rand over the last 2 years. We think that it's mind-boggling. It's a high-impact intervention, reaches a huge amount of people. It can help end youth unemployment, and yet we're cutting it. And of course, Chair, we made proposals as COSATU on the next round of two-part pension reforms, which we think should be accelerated. So proposals for here is that we would appeal to Parliament to consider amending the budget to reinforce the presidential employment stimulus to accommodate at least 1 million participants next year and 2 million by November next year. And of course, for us to fast track our two-part pension reform proposals for next year and a discussion on the SOD grant roadmap. Chair, I think just, give me the last 2 slides. On the revenue front, we must really commend SARS for doing excellent work, and it shows you the state can be rebuilt if you appoint competent management, fill vacancies, remove the corrupt elements, and invest in the capacity. And we would want to see more than just 2 billion rand given to SARS. They've improved tax compliance by about 3%. And we should be having a discussion, can they take us to a 70% tax compliance rate by 2026? Because that will generate an additional 120 billion rand of revenue to the state, which can make a huge difference. And we should see, can we ease the tax burden upon low-income workers and really adjust tax loopholes, wealth taxes of the variety of sorts for the wealthy. And of course, to action the president's commitment for a review of the fuel tax and the VAT exemption regime to see how can you ease the burden on the poor. But we think there is space, and really SARS, as it was for Madiba, can be the engine for the renewal of South Africa and the state. So Chair, just in conclusion, we think we don't have endless amount of times. A business as usual approach isn't going to resolve issues. I think we can see workers, society at large is really struggling. And yes, we need to reduce the debt, but I think for us, the way to do that is to grow the economy, to create jobs, to fix the state. And so we do hope in February we'll see a much more bold and progressive, decisive budget that finds the right balance, that doesn't further weaken state capacity to deliver public services. We have proposed in our meeting, Chair, with the Minister of Finance at NEDLAC on Friday, let's have a smaller team of government, of business, of labor, economists, etc., can be at NEDLAC to kind of work on what are some high impact interventions that could be announced in the February budget speech. But what we fear, Chair, is simply another budget as usual approach and somehow expecting different results. So let me stop there, Chair. I hope we stuck to the time allocated. Thanks so much, Chair, members.
Thanks, Comrade Matthew. The next stakeholder is IEJ. I'll request presenters to time themselves. I think almost all of the stakeholders who are in attendance today are not coming to this platform for the first time. So please assist the chairperson by self-timing. 15 minutes off the cop, you stop. IEJ.
Thanks, Chairperson. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. I'll just try to share our presentation. Please confirm if you can see my presentation. Can everyone see my presentation, Chair?
We can see
Yes.
it. Proceed.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I'd like to start with the overview, Chairperson, which is essentially that we are also very disappointed with the fact that despite the positive sentiment around the GNU and the priorities that they've set for themselves, this MTPPS cements a continuation of the previous administration's anti-poor allocation strategies and overall policy. We think that the MTPPS fails to provide the GNU with a credible policy direction and a viable financial basis to implement some of its key priorities. We remember that during the opening of Parliament, inclusive growth, job creation, and tackling poverty and the high cost of living, as well as building a capable development state were some of the key priorities. However, the fiscal strategy set out in the MTPPS continues to prioritize debt stabilization by cutting government expenditure and pursuing a budget surplus above all else. And this is despite the overwhelming evidence that has been shown on the impact of austerity on economic growth, inequality, and resourcing public services, which will also go into a bit in this presentation. Ultimately, Chair, we are recommending that there needs to be a paradigm shift on how we see the use of fiscal policy with new targets set for the government, such as unemployment, poverty, and long-term inclusive growth, as opposed to the narrow focus on debt stabilization. We do note, Chair, that in contrast to the 2023 MTPPS, there are no new cuts to overall government spending, that is consolidated main budget spending. But this must not be misconstrued as a change in overall policy direction, because in as much as the consolidated government spending will be 42.7 billion higher over the next 3 years compared to commitments in February, the non-interest expenditure, that is government spending minus interest payment, is expected to grow only by 4.2% over the medium term, which is below the CPI inflation of 4.5% and population growth of 1.5%. Ultimately, Chair, we would need about 6% growth in consolidated non-interest expenditure to just ensure that we meet the bare minimum standards of basic service delivery. We can see in this graph, Chair, that compared to if we had actually increased non-interest expenditure in line with inflation, we would be trending in line with the orange line, which is slightly higher compared to the trend where we are now, which is the blue line, where we've seen excessive cuts to non-interest spending. As a result, government spending has grown below inflation. Just to close this gap in 2024, we would need about 278 billion in additional spending to ensure that government is resourcing adequately and we can deliver services to those who need it the most. Chairperson, the impact of austerity are widely documented and we've presented to this committee, and studies actually do show that the impact of austerity extend beyond the short run, particularly on GDP. Austerity has been shown to permanently affect the expected part of GDP, and its effect on sustainability are exactly the opposite than its original goals. And so despite the fact that government is pursuing this strategy to reduce the debt to GDP ratio over the long run, the evidence seems to indicate that it will actually achieve the opposite, which is increasing debt levels, unemployment, and hunger which is where we essentially found ourselves now as a result of this policy direction and policy choice that has been implemented since 2012. Given the increasing evidence on the negative effect of austerity, we are concerned, Chairperson, that the National Treasury is considering the introduction of a fiscal rule. And in our recent discussion paper, we actually review international evidence and experiences with the fiscal rule, and we show that it actually leads to undermining legitimate contestation of the budget by stakeholders. It stifles growth and it also worsens austerity. Moreover, compliance to these fiscal rules is not adhered to by several countries. It is also worth noting, Chair, that the National Treasury, in its response to proposal for a fiscal rule, argued the following, open quote, "It is important to recognize that it is difficult to implement far-reaching fiscal rules because of South Africa's economic growth is persistently weak and the public finances are managing several large risks beyond the control of fiscal authorities," close quote. These risks, Chairperson, still exist and question why there is consideration for a fiscal rule in 2025. With that said, we still anticipate the release of the document that will lay the basis for this proposal and to participate in the consultations. Our recommendations in this regard, Chair, are that the role of fiscal policy overall is broadened to target unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and structural transformation of the economy. We also state that the National Treasury should increase consolidated non-interest expenditure in a manner that keeps in line with inflation and population growth. We'd like to also recommend that the committee commits to undertaking its own independent research on the international experience around fiscal rules and their implications for economic growth and inequality. On job creation and public employment, which is a key priority for the GNU, also see that it continues to receive a small share of the budget, which is around 0.9% of the total budget for the next 3 years. And we see that this is largely because the government views public employment as a drain on the fiscals as opposed to an investment on our future and long-term economic growth. We feel that this thinking is misguided, Chairperson, and needs to be changed, particularly because public servants' salaries are recovered through tax, and more importantly, public servants play an important role in delivering services to the most marginalized in townships, rural areas, and other important areas of our society. Chairperson, we see that despite commitments to expanding the public employment stimulus, it hasn't been mentioned in the MTPPS. And in this regard, we would like to ask the committee to seek clarity on the future of this program and its plans for it to be integrated to the expanded public works program. We recommend a progressive scaling up of public employment programs with the deliberate steps taken to ensure that they give recipients opportunities for longer-term work. With the current public sector wage negotiations currently underway, Chair, we would like to ensure that Treasury's provisional allocation is revised so that departments do not once again have to manage the cost by freezing posts and cutting essential frontline services. With resourcing to public services, Chair, we see that there continues to be cuts, and these cuts are actually as a result of this policy direction of fiscal consolidation. Even the MTPPS acknowledges that the ratio of the number of public users per public employee has increased from 44 to 48 people between 2017 to 2023. We see that when it comes to spending on healthcare users per capita, we see a decrease from around 4,100 to just under 4,000, 3.8. between 2024 and 2027. Spending per lane, on the other hand, receives a moderate increase from 18,800 to around 19,300. Chairperson, also welcome allocation to basic education. It's important to note that in the long term, this is offset by cuts to other essential expenditure such as healthcare. Ultimately, Chairperson, the resourcing in this MTPPS reflects the overall strategy of the National Treasury, where priorities are pitted against each other. And there is also a failure to recognize how the cuts of these essential services has a disproportionate effect on women who would have to step in and provide care work. This overall reduces their time in leisure and in searching for employment to provide for their families. Ultimately, Chairperson, we feel that MTPPS is very gender blind, and this is reflected in its omission on the progress to implement gender responsive budgeting. And this is disappointing given that it was noted as a commitment for the MTPPS. Chairperson, we would like to recommend that the committee seeks clarity on the implementation of the GRB, as well as it recommends that the human rights impact assessments are conducted, taking into account how the budget affects different groups of people. Chairperson, also like to recommend that a plan needs to be formulated with the necessary budget to fill critical frontline vacancies. With the last 3 minutes, Chairperson, I would like to turn to the SRD and to say that despite a slight increase in other social grants just in line with inflation, the SRD has been completely ignored. We see that it's not taken into account beyond March 2025 in terms of its plans and its the commitment for it to be used as a stepping stone for the basic income grant. And this is despite several public commitments and announcements by the President and the Department of Social Development. With this regards, we'd also like to state that we are against the proposal to digitalize the provision of social grants, particularly because they lead to exclusion of the deserving people of this grant. And this is something that is subject to litigation and was heard in court last week in a case that was brought forward by the IJ and #PayTheGrant supported by SERI. We recommend, Chair, in this regard that the SRD and the child support grant should be increased to the food poverty line in 2025 and budgeted for the ongoing provision into the medium-term expenditure framework. We recommend also that the proposal for the digitalization of the grant system need to be suspended and investigated by Parliament by looking at both local and international evidence. Chair, when it comes to infrastructure, it's also noteworthy that whilst there is an increasing trend and moderate increases towards infrastructure, we see that there is still a centering of public-private partnerships, whose evidence has been shown worldwide to increase costs for users and particularly exclude the majority when it comes to accessing basic services in the sense that they drive user fees and exclude the most marginalized. Our recommendations here, Chair, are that PPPs should not be adopted as a model for infrastructure development, given the wide-ranging evidence on their impact on widening inequality, that instead publicly owned development financial institutions should be leveraged to invest more in critical economic and infrastructure, and that DFIs are recapitalized with public funds and granted access to stable, low-cost, long-term funding in order to target key services and in order to stimulate structural transformation. With the last few seconds, Chair, I'd like to just conclude by noting that the MTBPS fails to raise proposals to raise revenue in order to resource government programs. And this stems from a failure particularly to take up proposals that were raised by IJ and by this committee. I'd like to quote the recommendation from this committee, which stated that while the MTPPS in 2023, the committee stated that while the MTPPS does not deal with the revenue proposal, the committee recommends NT seriously consider beyond their initial response, various revenue proposals by stakeholders during the committee's public hearings. And some of these proposals include removing the 65 billion retirement fund benefits given to those earning above 750,000, removing the 12 billion medical tax rebate for those earning over 500,000 per annum, discontinuing the ineffective employment tax incentive, which we could raise about 7 billion, introducing the social security tax to resource particularly the basic income grant, and also considering the introduction of a range of measures to tax wealth, such as a luxury VAT and the introduction of a wealth tax, and lastly, reversing the corporate income tax back to 28%, chairperson. So those are some of the revenue proposals we've previously raised to this committee, which we also continue to say they should be considered for going forward. I'd like to conclude there given the time constraint, chairperson, but those are some of our key recommendations and we look forward to engaging. Thanks.
Thanks, Zimbali. The next stakeholder, PEP. 15 minutes.
Chair, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. So just to start off, to say thank you very much to the committee for this opportunity. This presentation we will circulate to members. I'm not going to go through all of it. Just to note that it includes, I'm going to go through section 1, but there's also an assessment of the fiscal outlook, some analysis of spending pressures facing the budget in the future, and a focus on the health budget and possible measures to improve efficiencies in the health sector. So the starting point is that although Treasury did, or government did, defer the question of a legally encoded fiscal anchor to the next budget, saying that there will be a discussion document about the fiscal anchor in the next budget. Despite that, the MTBPS quite clearly is quite explicit in telling us what is the de facto fiscal anchor. And it's articulated in terms of two variables, in a sense, or two objectives. The first is to achieve a debt stabilizing primary surplus over the next 3 years. And the graph there shows Treasury's kind of baseline in the box for the MTBPS of what they think that debt stabilizing primary surplus is, I presume. But then there's a statement beyond the next 3 years that the minister repeated in his speech, which is that there's an intention to stabilize government debt over the rest of the decade. So it's not only a plan for 3 years, we have a fiscal anchor in a sense that has been announced that takes debt down along that path over the next decade. And I'll come back to some of the questions of that. Now, what is a primary balance? This graph is trying to show the components of that primary balance as far as our analysis is concerned. And the first is core spending. Core spending is spending that excludes interest payments, but it also excludes bailouts for state-owned companies and other financial obligations that the government might have. It just gives you an idea of how much the government is spending on its service delivery platform. And the other component is revenue. And so we've shown here the path of expenditure over the MTEF that is set out in the MTBPS, but also extrapolated that forward using Treasury's own statements about what is anchoring fiscal policy over the next decade. So what you can see is there, over the very long term, a very large increase in expenditure obligations up until about 2012, a large expansion of the state. And then from 2012 onwards, there was stabilization in the size of the state. With the beginning of the sixth administration, the spending began to increase. But really what drove that spike in 2020 is, of course, the COVID grant, which wasn't so much an increase in spending, but a fall in GDP. And these numbers are in terms of the spending to GDP ratio. So the denominator fell. That's why you get that big spike. In any case, the last 2 or 3 years have been about reversing the spending increase that took place in the sixth administration, in the first half before COVID. And that reversal has been fully achieved. And the plan over the MTEF is to continue forcing down or pushing down the size of state expenditure over the medium term and into the longer term over the next decade in the way that's depicted there. We, for our analysis, have just assumed that revenue after the MTEF remains stable as a share so the primary balance is the difference between this revenue line and this spending line. And as you can see, it was in deficit over the last decade and more, where spending was higher than revenue. And the plan, the fiscal anchor is to create this primary surplus, which should stabilize the debt level. I won't go over these. So the other big element of the MTBPS was de-risking and perhaps a movement towards a more dual capital budgeting framework. So there were various things announced about restructurings and an emphasis on de-risking in order to mobilize private sector capital behind public infrastructure projects. However, allocations to social infrastructure remain a weak point in the budget because we've heard before for many years announcements that capital spending will increase, but we've not seen the proof of the pudding in the eating. Governments often struggle to spend capital allocations. So, and let me just show you the graph quickly of this, is that if you look back to 2017, this is an index of the kind of gray line at the top is current spending, in other words, salaries and goods and services and all the other things. And the other lines are the components of capital spending that are voted on by national parliament. So this is not the choices of any other body. These are the choices of national parliament that national parliament has voted on. And you can see all elements of the capital budget have been substantially reduced since 2017. And the intention is to continue to reduce them over the MTEF. That's the last budget that Parliament adopted. And you can see, the line in blue at the bottom is national departments' capital spending. That will be 30% lower in real terms in 2026 than it was in 2017. So the focus on infrastructure, crowding in private infrastructure, is going together with a diminution of the resources allocated on the budget. Now, remember that most of public infrastructure, the economic infrastructure in particular, is not on the budget or shouldn't be. It's on the balance sheets of state-owned companies. What I'm talking about here is the money allocated to provincial and local government for social infrastructure and for the built environment that is being cut. Also, we see the infrastructure fund allocations being separated out from these very powerful targets on consumption spending. So squeezing down consumption spending and separating out the capital allocations. And this opens the possibility of dual budgeting where capital spending is treated separately, which has a number of problems, which I won't go into now. It remains to be seen whether the announcements about increased capital spending will succeed. So the macro fiscal implications of the policy baseline. So the policy baseline, what I'm talking about is this kind of primary balance path over the next 3 years and over the next 10 years, over the next decade, for the rest of this decade. So the macro fiscal implications is that, first of all, the size of the state is being permanently reduced. There was a significant expansion in the size of the state between 2000 and 2012. And then a stabilization, and now we are on a path of the reduction on the size of the state over an extended period and permanently, I think we should say. So more kind of technically, for the foreseeable future, the implication of the fiscal anchor is that the maximum growth rate of consumption spending is population growth plus CPI inflation. And note that who are the departments that are intensive in consumption spending? It is education, particularly basic education, health, and police and the broader criminal justice. Also, for instance, social development departments, all the things that need to employ people to deliver their services and give them goods and services. Those are the services that are intensive in consumption and therefore will bear the brunt of this path of consolidation. Also note that this bringing the state down as a share of GDP means that any growth in GDP in the period ahead will not apparently ease the fiscal constraint that government faces. So if there is growth, government, whatever growth is there, is not being shared with government. It's not resulting in higher revenues which are being translated into higher expenditure. We're keeping the spending path down and allowing GDP to grow faster than spending. So this fiscal stance will be a headwind on economic growth over the medium term and maybe over the long term. So in terms of aggregate demand, it's certain, and I mean, Treasury is projecting if you look at the economic projection, government consumption will contract in real terms in 2026 and in 2027. So what it means is that other components of aggregate demand have to weigh in even stronger in order to generate growth momentum. This is a headwind. We're also of the view that if this stance is combined with attempts at further disinflation, for instance, by reducing the inflation target, that would require even tougher austerity to be imposed on the budget in order to achieve debt stabilization targets. Because the question I suppose we're posing is government as a whole proposing a combined fiscal and monetary contraction at this moment when all of the talk is about a revived path of growth? And if they are proposing that, what will be the implications of that combination on the path of growth in these next few years of the 7th administration? In terms of service delivery, on the face of it, the policy baseline will lead to substantial reduction in the quantity and quality of inputs deployed to consumption-intensive departments. So both the salaries and the numbers of people, so the major inputs in those departments is human beings. And so the salaries of those human beings and the number of those human beings is going to be less. And I mean the nurses and the doctors and the police officers and the teachers on the one hand. So that's a diminution of the resource base. But of course, it's not only the compensation budget, it's also goods and services and other components of consumption, which are essential to deliver those services. So holding all other things equal, as economists like to say, ceteris paribus, this will result in diminished outputs. In other words, if you lower the inputs, you can expect that the outputs are going to be less. What are the outputs? It's the service levels that are being provided. This in turn will result in worsened performance. And how do you measure performance? It's things like, I don't know, how do you measure learning outcomes, for example, in the basic education sector? It will also lead to a deterioration in broader social outcomes. So this path of spending growth is, on the face of it, likely to increase unemployment, increase inequality, and increase poverty. The spending path, in our judgment, will lead to a retrogression of constitutional rights. And this, I think that the issue for me, at least on that question, is this needs to be taken seriously by government and explained. So government needs a really strong First of all, it has to accept that socioeconomic rights are that there will be these outcomes, or it needs to explain how those outcomes will be avoided. Now, the extent of the impact of government services might be moderated by efficiency gains, for example. But those on offer appear to be relatively small and limited, and also depend on complex reforms to achieve those efficiency gains. So in our analysis of the healthcare sector, we look at the spending reviews that have been done on healthcare. And these point to really important efficiency gains that can be found in the healthcare sector. That in many cases should be pursued, but from a budget, from a fiscal point of view, they are not significant. In other words, the amount of the spending that they plan to save is not going to make a fundamental difference to the fiscal path that I've set out, or that the MTBPS sets out. The damage inflicted by austerity on services and social outcomes will also depend on the choice of, at the moment, the approach to budget cutting with apologies to government is one of a lawnmower approach of cutting everything in the garden. Doesn't matter if it's grass or shrubs, or I don't know what else people keep in, flowers in their garden, but the lawnmower must cut everything. And this is in terms of the efficiency of public services and the effectiveness of public services, this is the worst possible way to impose cuts on public services. On the other hand, it is politically the least painful, because the alternative, which is to make specific policy decisions about specific state capacities that you will be withdrawing in order to release resources so that you can maintain, say, frontline services. Those choices are not unknown, but if you were to go down that path, you would face very tough resistance from people who are currently being funded in those areas. So politically, so the targeted closure of programs is, from an efficiency point of view, much better, but politically it's very difficult to execute. So the problem there is not so much Treasury's approach to fiscal consolidation, but the broader policy program of government, which is not aligned with fiscal policy. I see the 15 minutes has ended, so I will just leave. As I said, I will circulate the rest of the presentation to members, but let me go to my concluding slide. That the fiscal path will remain a headwind on economic growth. It will the path also leads to a permanent contraction in the size of the state. The implications of this for service levels must be clearly estimated by government officials. That's their constitutional obligation. The question of how the spending path will be achieved without compromising constitutional rights also needs to be answered. And if government is taking a path towards retrogression, it needs to make this explicit and say why. Greater clarity. I didn't go into this, but sorry, Chair. Just one last point. You see the table on the right is from the last IMF report on South Africa, staff report. And you can see there that the staff in this table means the IMF staff, and the authorities in this table means the National Treasury. So if the fiscal anchor is targeting a debt stabilizing primary balance, we must agree on what is a primary balance to start off with. It must be clear and explicit and not fudged. And this is showing not only the IMF's estimate is different from the authorities, but it's actually of a different sign. One is a deficit and the other one is a surplus. So this needs to be resolved amongst other issues. So greater clarity is needed on the fiscal anchor. Reducing the inflation target will make it doubly difficult to achieve fiscal goals. Further disinflation will lower the rate of nominal growth and raise the gap between growth and interest rates. This would require Treasury to inflict harsher expenditure cuts to achieve debt sustainability. And just to shout out to my colleagues, Toko and Owen and Rashad, who are in the room and may answer some of the questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you. ADEC, 15 minutes.
Sorry, Chair, did you say AIDC or someone else?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Alternative Information and Development Center.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, thank you, everyone. Are you able to see this?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'm Alia Chikta from the Alternative Information and Development Center. Thank you for the opportunity to present on the revised fiscal framework and revenue proposals. There are 4 things that I'm going to be doing in the submission. The first is that I'm going to be providing a critique on the orientation of the fiscal framework. Secondly, I'll be outlining expenditure trends and the dangers of fiscal austerity. Thirdly, I'll be showing how more of a burden is placed on expenditure as opposed to revenue, and therefore I'll be advocating for an increase to the tax to GDP ratio. And lastly, I'll be discussing how austerity opens the way for further liberalization through Operation Venezuela. Just to start off with a critique on the orientation of the fiscal framework. So stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio is presented as the goal of fiscal policy, presumably to address escalating debt service costs. Leading to reduce the government's debt has been the main reason given for the implementation of a harsh austerity program, or what is referred to by government as fiscal consolidation. While the growth in government debt levels and debt service costs are a concern, the growth in debt is also not unique to South Africa. Moreover, the current debt levels is not significantly different from other countries, from other similar countries. Compared to estimates contained in the 2024 budget review, debt servicing costs will be 6.7 billion rand higher for this financial year, despite the optimism from certain interest groups around improved economic performance under the new administration and stringent austerity measures. This has not resulted in the containment of these debt servicing costs. Fundamentally, the underlying problem in the economy is not debt, but rather mass unemployment and stagnating economic growth. Cutting budgets undermines the prospects for economic growth and often results in a growing debt to GDP ratio over the medium term. So as government spends less on GDP, as government spends less, GDP shrinks, and then therefore the reductions in debt is not enough to offset the reductions in GDP, so this ratio actually increases over time. Critically, the government's budget is not the same as the household budget. If governments invest in the economy, it can stimulate growth, which helps to reduce the government's debt as a share of the total economy. Cutting budgets contributes to shrinking the economy and results in growing inequalities. Austerity is therefore the wrong way to deal with growing levels of government debt. So to continue, there are some additional mitigating factors to the government's debt levels. One is that approximately 90% of the government's debt is owed in rands. This is a favorable situation as it reduces exchange rate risks and reduces pressure on the state to raise hard currency to service foreign denominated debts. South Africa also has a substantial balance sheet, which includes high levels of foreign exchange reserves that can be utilized as part of a more effective and equitable public debt management strategy. The government employees pension fund has average annual surpluses of 50 billion rand. The vast surplus is unnecessary for the guaranteed payment of pensions and is currently over-invested in corporate equity. A large portion of the surplus can be shifted to public investment, which even in the form of a zero-interest loan can be done without endangering workers' pensions or the survival of the PIC and government employees pension fund. So lots of people have already spoken about the proposal to have a fiscal rule to make a primary budget surplus legally and the dangers of this. So state spending is a legislative function. In this case, Parliament is the decision-making body. Since Parliament is legally bound to the Constitution, a cap on spending imposed by the National Treasury would be inappropriate under the constitutional framework. Moreover, restrictions on spending will hamper growth, resulting in the failure of the fiscal rule to meet its objective of reducing the debt to GDP ratio. And this is the ratio that I spoke about in the previous slides and explaining how that dynamic works. So interestingly, the Standing Committee on Finance recommended in its March 2024 report that the binding fiscal anchor should not be the trajectory of fiscal policy in relation to public expenditure, as they limit fiscal policy parameters and narrow the National Treasury's fiscal policy orientation. Despite Parliament's recommendation and the deepening of structural socioeconomic needs, Treasury worryingly intends to continue maintaining sufficiently large primary surpluses over the rest of the decade. And what we can see as a result of austerity and as a result of the fiscal framework is that unemployment, poverty, and inequality have worsened under these austerity measures. Orthodox policy tools such as the pursuit of a primary budget surplus are being used to address unorthodox policy goals such as poverty, inequality, and unemployment reductions. The economic outlook contained in the MTBPS does not mention trends, changes, or objectives in relation to South Africa's triple challenge. The focus of the fiscal framework, economic outlook, and fiscal policy components in the MTBPS, so this is largely chapters 1, 2, and 3, is centered around so-called inclusive economic growth and a stabilization of the debt to GDP ratio. Inclusive economic growth and debt stabilization should, however, be viewed as outputs and not as outcomes. The outcomes in this case are reductions in poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Revisions to the fiscal framework should be centered around trends in poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and how these indicators respond to fiscal and economic policies over time. Even under Operation Vulindlela, unemployment has worsened, and currently we have almost 12 million people are unemployed, when including the 2.8 million discouraged workers, and this is equivalent to 50% of the workforce. 75% of unemployed are in long-term unemployment. And over here, we can see what is happening to the poverty headcount over time. The economic outlook in the MTBPS does not mention poverty, nor does it track it over time. Stats SA, partly due to constraints in budget allocations, has not released poverty statistics in almost a decade. So the last time we measured poverty was in 2015 over here. So we do not know what's happening from 2015 until 2024. Estimates suggest that there are approximately 16.4 million adults of the working age population who live below the food poverty line. But again, these are estimates. We do not know exactly how poverty is changing. Obviously, during COVID, there was an increase in the poverty headcount and in the poverty gap, but we do not know exactly how the fiscal and economic policies are impacting or changing poverty levels. So what you can see in this graph is that between 2011 and 2015, poverty increased for all the different lines of poverty, both the upper bound poverty line, the lower bound poverty line, and the food poverty line. Since we do not know what is happening in almost the last 10 years, we have to rely on anecdotal evidence. Horrifically, in 2023, there was a case about a mother in the Eastern Cape who had to kill her starving children and herself because of the utter desperation that she faced. And I put this here just to indicate the depth and to add some weight to these figures that you can see in 2015. The point here being is that if we continue with these austerity measures and we continue with cuts to social grants, we can see we will see an increase of this trend over time. So I'm now going to move on to expenditure trends and fiscal austerity. So the government is proposing a reduction in main spending as a percentage of GDP from 28.4% to 27.6% over the medium term. The reduction in main budget expenditure is more profound for non-interest expenditure, which faces a worrying decline from 23.4% to 22.4% over the medium term between 2021 and 2022 and 2027-28. Financial year's non-interest expenditure is expected to drop from 25.6 to 22.4%. That's a lot of numbers in a very long phrase. So this basically means that there's a shrinking state over time. A 20.1 billion rand increase for non-interest expenditure is proposed over the next 3 years. However, this remains inadequate and there are still cuts to key areas of social spending. Some of the main real cuts include reductions in spending on education and social protection. Between the 2024 and 2025-26 financial years, we can expect to see real cuts of 4.1 billion rand to learning and culture. Major aspects of these cuts to learning and culture are to post-school education and training, which is in contradiction to the overall policy goal of inclusive growth. If people who complete their basic education, who are able to enter into tertiary institutions, are unable to afford the fees and unable to get the financial support to succeed. There are cuts in areas that disproportionately impact women. There was a deferral of a gender-responsive budgeting approach, and this undermines gender equity objectives. Strikingly, there's a 21 billion rand nominal difference for social grants, specifically between the revised estimate for 2024-25 and 2025-26 financial year. The finance minister did not state what will happen to the SRD, nor is it explicitly stated in the MTBPS. If the SRD grant is removed and inflationary adjustments to other grants are applied, this would mean that there is an additional 5.8 billion rand to social grants over the medium term. Unclear if this will allow for above inflationary adjustments or to other grants such as the child support grant or the old age pension, or if this is set aside for a very limited job seekers grant. The limited job seekers grant would be a problem because one, it wouldn't be enough to cover the full cost of seeking a job, and secondly, and more importantly, you're not going to address unemployment by asking people to apply for jobs if the jobs do not exist. There are also cuts to the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development of 12 and 4%, just in real terms over the next 3 years. There is concern that the early retirement packages will result in posts being frozen rather than filled, adding to a further drop in headcounts for health, education, and community safety. While stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio has been cited as a primary justification for budget reductions in specific areas, it is troubling that those most dependent on public services are bearing the brunt of these cuts. So what we can see is that there is an increasing burden placed on and an increased trend by Treasury to reduce expenditure, but we do not see the same in terms of taxes. So we are advocating for an increase in the tax to GDP ratio. There are repeated concerns around the debt to GDP ratio under context where the tax to GDP ratio has had a targeted cap of below 25% in the post-apartheid period. The government's failure to increase the total level of taxes significantly benefits the country's wealth classes at the expense of the majority. The uneven distribution of income growth is a symptom of the underlying structural inequalities and should be addressed through various redistributive frameworks. The MTBPS states that further gains will be made in tax compliance. So this is about making more money available for SARS. So I'm just going to skip this long bit, but basically there's a funding shortfall of 17 to 20 billion. And what we can see is that 226 million rand additional resulted in an additional 14 billion rand of revenue. So there's a 600% return on investment when SARS is adequately funded. Increasing the tax to GDP ratio will allow for a narrowing of budget deficit and a lower burden on social services. Now we can see over here the tax to GDP ratio being flat and the government debt as a percentage of GDP rising, and lots of this happened during the COVID pandemic as well as during the state capture years. So in terms of...
How far are you from concluding?
I have 3 more slides, but I'll try to be quick. Is it okay if I just take 1 more minute?
1 minute, please. Please,
Thank
Carlo.
you. So there are different ways in order to increase the tax GDP ratio. That's going to include scope to reversing almost 2 decades of above inflation adjustments to the personal income tax bands, combating illicit financial flows, adopting the UN tax convention and a wealth tax. We are worried that austerity opens the way for further liberalization through Operation Vulindlela. The increased privatization and de-risking of private sector investment will be driven by public-private partnerships, concessional finance, and complex financing instruments primarily geared to guarantee profits to the private sector. Economic growth is at 1.1%, 0.2 percentage points lower than previously predicted, despite the pro-privatization narrative of Operation Vulindlela. And there's a risk that this type of growth will not actually be inclusive, but will rather undermine reductions in poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip through this and just talk about the dangers of PPPs if done in the wrong way. An example, the MTBPS states that the Gautrain is a tried and tested mechanism to infrastructure. Sorry?
Please go to the last slide and conclude.
Yeah.
AIDC. I've been patient, but I'll be unfair to the other stakeholders.
Okay. Basically, so I just wanted to say that the MTBPS is orientated around creating the enabling environment for growth without any guarantee that this growth will be inclusive and linked to the developmental goals and outcomes.
Also, that we can read for ourselves.
Okay.
You are abusing us now.
Are you concluding?
Yes, that was my conclusion. Sorry for taking so much time.
Thanks. Dr. S. Muller, over to you.
Thanks, Chairperson. I'm just going to share my screen. So give me a moment. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so for some reason it's not going into full screen mode, so I'll just take it slide by slide. That's okay. So good morning? Yes, good morning, honourable members, honourable chairpersons. I'm not going to talk to very detailed issues, as for example in the previous presentation. Unfortunately, I didn't see the other ones, so I can't comment on whether I'll be repeating some of what they said. I will be repeating a number of issues that, many issues, in fact, that I've raised in previous presentations. And my justification for doing so is twofold. First of all, that many of those issues haven't been addressed in subsequent MTBPS documents or in subsequent budget documents. And furthermore, of course, we have a new parliament. And so there are many members or some members who will not be familiar with some of these issues. Just to start off very briefly, I've done this a couple of times before. I think it really remains very important. There's always this issue when the public come to present to Parliament of what capacity we are presenting in. And I've raised concerns before also about the capacity in which some individuals refer to themselves as representatives of civil society. They have no particular demonstrable mandate. We have other individuals who claim to speak on sort of behalf of the economics profession and so forth, and that's also problematic. What I'll just say here is that I present in my individual capacity based on my technical expertise and my experience in public economics, public finance, and political economy, combined, of course, with a concern for the economy and the national interest. Okay. So to move on to some core procedural issues, and these are a core part of my submission, as they have been in the past. I just want to remind members, old and new, of the concern that the call for submissions on the MTBPS really doesn't give enough time to make substantive inputs on the revised and the proposed fiscal frameworks. And I emphasize these two notions because, as the second point makes clear, these are often conflated in even parliamentary communication and very much more so in the public domain. So there isn't really a clear distinction when the MTBPS is tabled that there are two very different fiscal frameworks being tabled. The one is the revised fiscal framework for the existing fiscal year, and the other is the proposed fiscal framework for the subsequent 3 years, right, over the medium term. And the Money Bills Act makes a clear distinction between these two things. But when public submissions happen, and we see this every year with, and I'm sure it's been the case with the kinds of submissions you've already heard, there's really no clear distinction between them. But the MTBPS is often incorrectly described in the media as a mini budget. Right. I don't know if that's because the MTBPS is shorter than the MTBPS documents are shorter than the actual budget documents. Okay. But it's not a mini budget. The purpose of the MTBPS is really for Parliament and the public to think very seriously about the medium-term budget proposals. Right, and that should be a much more substantive discussion than could arguably take place in the very short time frame allocated under the Money Bills Act. Some previous chairpersons have acknowledged this problem, but have also argued it's very difficult to address. Well, I will still keep putting it on the table. Also, just a reminder that the traditional approach by National Treasury to the revenue proposals doesn't really make sense. Parliament is sort of expected to approve them in principle when they're first tabled with the budget, but then they're only finalized much later in the year. This doesn't really make sense. Furthermore, it is very useful to revisit the list of issues that should be considered when examining or amending the fiscal frameworks. Okay, now that's under Section 8.5 of the Money Bills Act. An interesting point about this is that it places a much greater onus on Parliament if Parliament wants to make an amendment than it does on the National Treasury. If you look at those items under Section 8.5, and you compare them to what's provided in the MTBPS or even in the budget, National Treasury often fails to address the substantive questions that are asked by that section. Okay, so as I mentioned before, it's very important to distinguish between the revised and the proposed fiscal frameworks within the time available. I'm not going to be able to do much substantive here, but certainly institutions like the FFC and the PBO and other parties that want to make substantive submissions should be distinguishing between these two things. But at the same time, there's an onus on Parliament to facilitate that and actually separate the consideration of these two different fiscal frameworks. Okay. Very crucially, honourable members, given the political change that has just happened this year, it's, I think, important to restate the fact that Parliament has the power to amend almost every substantive aspect of the budget. And the general consensus on why that hasn't happened since about 1996, when the Constitution was passed that gave Parliament this power that was subsequently elaborated in the Money Bills Act, is essentially because the political grouping, the political party that controlled the executive also controlled Parliament. Now, one might say that's still the same because we have a coalition. In a sense, that's true, and that's probably why there isn't going to be an amendment. But there certainly was a hope for those who were hoping for some kind of non-majority Parliament, was that Parliament would take its amendment powers more seriously, given that no single party held a majority. So I think that's something that's very important to put on the table, given the political changes that we've seen this year. Okay, so I'm going to restate some proposals and issues that I raised in relation to in previous submissions. And in all cases, my view is that none of these have been adequately addressed. So rather than keep coming up with new concerns and new issues and just make this list longer, I decided that I'm just going to largely repeat issues that I've raised before that, in my view, haven't been adequately addressed. And once again, we see manifesting in the MTBPS. First of all, and really, honourable members, I think a number of these things are really basic in terms of, basic requirements, quite reasonable requests, and certainly the kinds of issues that should be adequately addressed by National Treasury when providing information to yourselves, never mind the rest of us. So first of all, Treasury must provide modelling of the expected costs of tax incentives. Every year, National Treasury comes with proposals for various incentives or adjustments to various incentives and doesn't provide any significant modeling or estimates of the long-term costs of these incentives. How are members of parliament supposed to make informed decisions about the merits of these incentives if National Treasury doesn't provide that information? Of course, such estimates are speculative. But nevertheless, presumably, when National Treasury comes up with these ideas, it must have some sense of how much they're going to cost, because otherwise it would be irresponsible to be tabling them in Parliament. As you'll know, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about already, fiscal consolidation is really at the core of current fiscal policy. But again, National Treasury isn't really very forthcoming with the kind of modeling that underpins its decisions about fiscal consolidation. In particular, why it's chosen some debt to GDP ratios rather than others. So notice, I'm not necessarily criticizing the approach that the National Treasury has adopted here. One can make arguments in different directions, but there should be a more substantive justification for why National Treasury has proposed the particular thresholds that it used. I say in a further slide, I'll just say it now, that prior to the COVID pandemic, there was a view that South Africa should be, trying to push the debt to GDP ratio down to 40%. Now we have a new normal, and we're not the only country that has that because of the expansionary policy that was required to respond to the COVID shutdowns and so forth. But in this new normal in particular, the question is, well, why choose one particular debt to GDP ratio rather than another? And this is, of course, very salient in the context of debates and discussions about fiscal rules and other kinds of measures in which essentially Parliament, with the encouragement of National Treasury, would tie its hands when it comes to these issues. But that's something that we can discuss elsewhere. Another crucial issue, which I'll touch on in a later slide, is around wage negotiations and this issue of protecting service delivery posts. I'll elaborate more on that shortly. Renewable energy incentives, this is a particular issue, a subset of issues related to the first point I made about providing the expected costs of tax incentives. I should note, honourable members, for full information, that sometimes when I've raised these issues, I have had private, or shall we say individual communication from National Treasury with a little bit of additional information. And my view has always been, well, I'm grateful to receive that information, but I cannot see why it's not tabled in Parliament. So my view is that those who should have the most information, and I think this is consistent with the Constitution, are members of Parliament. Parliament holds Treasury accountable, Parliament has the amendment powers, Parliament must approve all these proposals. And if those issues, if that information is tabled in Parliament, then by and large, the rest of us will have access to this information. So I'm not a big fan of National Treasury's approach, as well-intentioned as it might be, of providing information bilaterally. My view is this kind of supporting information that I've listed here and elsewhere should be provided to Parliament as standard, and then the rest of us can maybe request additional information if necessary. I mentioned here the Lady R saga. It was a big issue last year. To my knowledge, and various sources, including I think National Treasury, suggested it did have a negative effect on South Africa's public finances, and particularly the cost of borrowing. I'm not aware of any publicized estimate of the fiscal cost of that. Seems important. Another issue on which National Treasury needs to provide more information is on conditionalities and the terms of loan agreements with international financial institutions. This is becoming increasingly important because of efforts to essentially take non-traditional forms of debt whilst trying to maintain the fiscal consolidation path. So it's other submissions in previous years have also raised this as a concern. Very important issue at the moment is the SRD grant. I'm sure you've heard about that already, but there is also litigation related to that. National Treasury wasn't very forthcoming in the budget or in the previous MTBPS with information about its stance on that litigation, which seeks to expand the SRD grant potentially quite significantly. If you think about a company, honourable members, if a company was involved in litigation, they would have to make some kind of statement, they would have to make some kind of estimate of the potential cost that they might incur in that litigation. I think it's reasonable to ask for something similar of the National Treasury. And then the employment tax incentive, which I'll say quite a bit more about shortly. Okay, so just to say a little bit more about the renewable energy tax incentive issue. many members may be familiar with this notion of a power utility death spiral. The basic intuition of it is that as the utility finds itself in difficulty, might be logistical or operational, it might be financial, but typically that leads to an increase in tariffs. The result is that users who can partially defect from the grid do, but those users tend to be wealthier. Because of that defection, the power utility puts up tariffs more people who can pay defect, and ultimately tariffs keep increasing, but the people who are paying them become less and less well off, and ultimately it becomes financially unsustainable. Now, Eskom's definitely been on this path for a while, and I won't go into the history of that. But one of the interesting things that National Treasury, through some of its incentives, has essentially fueled that death spiral. Okay. Now, National Treasury makes various arguments in favor of those incentives, but the costs to Eskom and indirectly, therefore, the cost to the national balance sheet through Eskom has never been adequately addressed. So this is over and above the failure of National Treasury to provide Parliament with clear estimates of the costs of these incentives. And so this is a really big concern. And in the absence of such evidence, my conclusion previously was that some of these renewable energy tax incentives are basically going to end up as potentially end up as large rent-seeking schemes. I have even bigger concerns about the employment tax incentive. I've been raising these on and off for over a decade. However well-intentioned or not it may have been, there's actually no credible evidence that the ETI creates jobs. But it has cost probably over 40 billion rand so far. And based on the current approval period, will cost many tens of billions more. That's a huge amount of money to spend on a project that doesn't seem to be yielding any of the benefits that it was supposed to be yielding. And it's particularly concerning in a context where expanded public works program jobs and community works program jobs are being cut. Now, whatever one might say about those programs, what we can be fairly sure, aside from the issue of sort of ghost workers or ghost recipients, is that those programs do create jobs. If you employ 10,000 people with the EPWP, you have created 10,000 jobs. Might only be for that year, fine, but at least we know we've created the jobs. When it comes to the employment tax incentive, it's speculative. We use econometric methods to try and estimate whether jobs have been created. As I say, my professional assessment of this, and without being immodest, I think I'm one of the best positioned people in the country to make this assessment. My professional assessment of this is there's no credible evidence that the ETI has created any significant number of jobs. Okay? And that is very concerning given the amount of money that is being spent on it. Okay, just a few more substantive issues. This was the debt sustainability and fiscal consolidation issue that I was mentioning earlier. Previously, much lower levels of debt to GDP were considered sustainable. We've got a new normal. Why is National Treasury trying to stabilize below 80% or around 75%? Where is the detailed modeling and substantive explanation for that decision, which is crucial because it drives really everything else in the budget? A sort of more political economy issue, but really very, very important for this MTBPS is the problem of National Treasury's mandate. It's I think fairly well established in literature and commentary on this issue that since 1994, in fact, the National Treasury has gone well beyond its public finance mandate. Now, some people think this is a good thing, some people think it's a bad thing. But one of the problems is that National Treasury often denies that that's the case, which means it also denies responsibility for when things go wrong. So when National Treasury pushes a particular policy in the transport sector and it fails, then the National Treasury says, well, we're not the transport policy making or implementation department. But that doesn't stop them from pushing that particular policy. Now, this is an important point to make because National Treasury is constantly making reference to and relying on Operation Vulindlela, which actually operates from the presidency. Now, I'm not a big fan of Operation Vulindlela. I don't find it convincing at all. I think its achievements are massively overstated, and I think the rationale for its policies are not good and far from evidence-based. But the point I want to make here in the context of the MTBPS is it's remarkable how little the MTBPS deals with core public finance issues, which are the National Treasury's core mandate and which are the purpose of the MTBPS. And it spends a lot of time with vague gesturing at structural reforms and Operation Vulindlela and economic growth. And of course, economic growth is fundamental to public finance. And if we can increase economic growth in South Africa, it will help with many public finance problems. But nevertheless, that is officially outside of the National Treasury's core mandate. So it was disappointing not to see more about core public finance issues. Yes,
Dr.
thank
Muller,
you. Thank you.
move towards the last slide of concluding.
Yes, thank you, Honourable Chairperson. As another member said, you can always read the details of the slides. So I'll just skip to this last point. As I say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Parliament needs to take its amendment powers more seriously. It needs to demand more from the Treasury, but it also needs to demand more from the institutions that support it, particularly the Parliamentary Budget Office and the Financial and Fiscal Commission. But I do put it in that order. National Treasury is the institution that has the greatest capacity in funds and can provide this information. And then the PBO and the FFC can do more with that information. Of course, you should know that the PBO does have information requesting powers itself now, thanks to an amendment in the Act, and I think they could be putting that to more use. It should, right, this is the third point as well. And then finally, and this is really the crucial overall point, is that many of the substantive problems and limitations of the MTBPS and the budget over the last decade remain in the current MTBPS. So there seems to be a lack of an ability to think differently in a way that's really going to change the public finance trajectory of the country. Thank you for your time, honourable members.
Thank you. Hila, over to you. Hila, are you there?
Good morning, Chair and honorable members. I'm just currently, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
15 minutes allocated to you.
So good morning, Chair. I will be representing Hila. My name is Bilal Mazayabo. And we are talking about the submission to the Standing Committee. Hila welcomes the MTPS as presented by the Minister of Finance. Unfortunately, no mention of the health promotion levy was made. We trust that the National Treasury will uphold its commitment to the 2025 budget to increase the health promotion levy, and that a discussion paper on the expansion of the health promotion levy and its threshold reduction will be produced urgently for public comments. So as we know, over 35 top experts on obesity, diet-related diseases, and public health, NCDs, from some of the world's leading universities have written to different treasuries all over the world to support the increase of the HPL to 20%. They're also very impressed with the results of evaluations done by the current HPL. So why should South Africa raise SSBs, or sugar sweetened beverages? SSBs are widely available and heavily promoted, making them easily overconsumed, contributing to the overconsumption of free sugars. So I'm going to jump straight into the problem with SSBs. It displaces the consumption of healthy alternatives like water and milk. SSB does not provide any nutritional value by high energy intake from the sugar consumed, and then the individuals who consume these SSB do not compensate for the extra kilojoules by eating less food or more nutritional food. So excess consumption of free sugars is linked to weight gain and obesity, and then non-communicable diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and dental caries. So South Africa currently has a health crisis, and we've seen an increase in numbers with people living with NCDs. With more than 4 million people living with diabetes, only 2 million of them being diagnosed with diabetes. So what is the current impact of the health promotion levy? So when it was introduced at 11%. We would love it to be at 20%. Currently, it's around 6%, but even at 6%, we've seen the reduction of sales of sugary sweet beverages. We've seen the industry incentivize and reformulate a lot of the offers, the SSBs, to contain less sugar. We've seen changing dietary patterns by creating consumer awareness, so people are more aware of the sugar that they're consuming. So in South Africa alone, within the first 2 years, 51% reduction in sugar and 29% reduction in sugary sweet beverages, especially in lower income households, and they are the ones that are most vulnerable to non-communicable diseases. An example will be in the Western Cape in Langa. Young adults reported a 37% reduction in volume. So they drank 37% less SSBs and 31% less sugar after the HPL was implemented. In Soweto, adolescents and young adults reduced their sugar consumption by 2 times. So they were drinking half of what they were drinking before. So the higher the HPL, the better the benefits. In its first 3 years of implementation, the HPL generated almost 8 billion rand in cumulative revenue for the country. What we are estimating that it could have generated about 13 billion rand to date, and that the National Treasury missed about 800 million rand adding it to the fiscus. Taxing it at 20%, which what we are recommending, will bring about 3 billion annually. So the other advantage is it reduces healthcare costs. The cost of obesity in 2022 was estimated to be 33 million rand, representing almost 1% of our GDP and the Department of Health's expenditure. It's estimated that by 2030, type 2 diabetes will cost us about 35 billion rand. And if we raise the HPL to 20%, we could save 5 billion rand in healthcare costs over the next 20 years. So again, we're trying to improve health equity with the HPL. Lower income households are more receptive to price changes. Specially designed taxes can improve health equity if the poor benefit most from them. Obesity and NCDs disproportionately affect the poor, and the HPL has been successful in reducing the amount of sugary sweet beverages consumed in both lower and higher end households. What is the future of the HPL? The HPL has proven to be a cost-effective public health measure, and it can reduce the health crisis while simultaneously raising revenue that the National Treasury really needs. How can National Treasury protect and safeguard and strengthen the HPL? Well, I think most importantly by committing to a 20% increase for the 2025-2026 budget, urgently releasing the discussion paper on the expansion of the HPL to include fruit juices and the reduction of its threshold. So Hila believes that the government has plenty of evidence to prove that the HPL is working and can do even more. And it shows that the HPL protects public health policies and increases the price of harmful products, in turn protecting South Africans. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hila. Amandla Mobi.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Good morning to the committee members and everyone in the room. Please give me a moment to share my screen.
Bilal, can you please stop sharing your screen?
Dear members of the Standing Committee on Finance, our presentation today brings to you the concerns and demands of those who will be directly impacted by the decisions that underpin the 2024 revised framework and revenue proposals. The MTBPS tabled by Finance Minister Godongwana is a 2 out of 10. For many years, the Amandla.Mobi community has consistently communicated clear demands of the people to National Treasury as well as this committee. Honorable members, it is disappointing that Finance Minister Godongwana continues on the trajectory of anti-poor budgeting, even though it is clear that the majority in Mzansi are experiencing a devastating poverty crisis which needs to be urgently resolved. Over 9 million people in Mzansi experience hunger and poverty every day, while over 8 million people are unemployed. In his MTBPS, Minister Godongwana failed to address the people's needs and instead continued with his practices that undermine President Ramaphosa's commitments to end poverty through measures such as implementing the BIG. The private sector was mentioned 12 times in his speech. He speaks about tackling poverty, all right, a song that has been sung way before his time, but things keep getting worse for our people. With this, the minister has ultimately failed to draw a clear picture of how the GNU plans to take immediate steps to end poverty for the marginalized majority. Minister Godongwana has continued cutting the budget for essential services. What is even more unacceptable is that part of his reasoning for a budget deficit in his MTBPS is due to the provisional 2.7 billion rand budget for the 370 SRD grant, among other reasons. Budget cuts especially for essential services such as health and education, cannot in any way be excused in the name of paying debt or creating opportunities for the private sector. Over the past years, very little has been achieved to benefit the poor through Minister Godongwana's budgets. Instead, what we keep seeing is more opportunities created for the private sector to flourish. It is no secret that the private sector cares more about its profits than the people, and it is saddening to see Minister Godongwana put the sector in the forefront while the poor continue to suffer. For many years, civil society and members of the public have called for the urgent implementation of the basic income grant, which is no longer a matter of debate. Prior to the elections, President Ramaphosa and the ANC promised the implementation of the BIG in 2 years. However, there are still no clear plans on how the government plans to execute implementation. The MTBPS was a good chance for Minister Godongwana to detail how the government plans to implement the BIG in the next 2 years. We demand that Minister Godongwana treat BIG as an urgent intervention and detail clear plans for its implementation. In his plans to implement the BIG, the Minister and National Treasury must not cut budgets for other essential social interventions such as grants, including the SRD. The MTBPS has seemingly caused confusion about whether National Treasury and the Finance Minister have now broken their promise to provide funding for the SRD until March 2027 and instead plan to end the SRD in March 2025. National Treasury and the Finance Minister must be clear about their plans and timeline to increase the SRD. In his budget speech earlier this year, the minister said that work is underway to improve the grant by April this year. What happened to that promise? Can Treasury please explain why the budget is seemingly reduced for grants in 2025, 26 and 2027? We maintain our demand that the 370 grant be increased to match the food poverty line of 796 and keep it until it is turned into a BIG of 1,500. National Treasury has previously tried to scrape the SRD grant and replace it with another grant that would exclude even more people. We call on this committee to ensure that the SRD is not scrapped and that more budget is allocated so that all who need it get it. Social grants are a lifeline for 28 million people in Mzansi, with over 10 million children on the child support grant. However, the social grants have gradually become inadequate to keep up with the cost of living. Food is expensive, not to mention other essential needs and services. The average cost to feed a child a nutritious meal is now over 900 per child per month. According to the PMBEJD, the average food basket costs over 5,000 rand. A household of 4 people typically survives on one income, which is rarely enough to cover monthly costs of food, transport, and electricity, among other things. Minister Godongwana has continued increasing grants with very little amounts. This is unacceptable. The cost of living has become impossible to keep up with. The supermarket industry continues to make questionable profits while people bleed money they don't have just to buy basics. The Competition Commission has consistently raised concerns that when producer costs go down, prices on supermarket shelves take a long time to go down, if they do at all. Even with the zero-rated food items, food is still expensive and many can't afford it. We call on Minister Godongwana and National Treasury to increase all social grants by 500 rand, expand VAT zero-rated food items, and provide additional funding to the Competition Commission to strengthen their capacity to investigate and take action against supermarkets and other big businesses that are profiteering and deepening poverty. The moratorium on the sugary drinks tax is set to be lifted in the next budget speech in 2025, but the sugar industry is fighting to extend it for another 5 years. If Minister Godongwana and National Treasury allow the sugar industry to get their way again, this will not only have dire consequences for people's health, but also show that National Treasury is easily bullied by the industry. We cannot afford another extension, let alone a 5-year extension. National Treasury should note that the industry's claims about jobs have been debunked, including the NEDLAC jobs report, have been debunked by Wits academics. We call on National Treasury to increase the sugary drinks tax to 20% in his budget in February 2025 and to finally start the long overdue public consultation process to expand the sugary drinks tax to include fruit juice. Increasing taxes for the ultra-rich is no longer a topic of debate. It is something that needs to happen. For far too long, the rich have continued seeing massive profits and cash in their wallets while the poor continue to suffer. The rich will not starve if they pay a little more tax. It is time to end the prioritization of the private sector, as we have seen over the years that the sector cares more about profits than the people. Mzansi cannot continue to be declared the most unequal country in the world. The government of national unity must start unifying the people by ensuring that all who live in Mzansi live with dignity. Thank you, Honorable Chair. That's the end of our presentation.
Thank you. So the last stakeholder, BJC.
Okay, that's us. I will share our screen now. Share. Can I just get an indication that we can see our presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make this presentation, and thank you very much for squeezing our presentation in as the BJC. I'm Matsidi Solengwasa, and I'll be making this presentation on behalf of our coalition. So, our coalition is a coalition of 22 civil society organizations, and really our interest in the fiscal framework, the revised fiscal framework, is how we can build a state that is capable of delivering upon constitutional obligations to the people of this country. The previous slide just explains some of the organizations that make up the coalition, but also the friends of the coalition. So the context that we find ourselves, I think the previous presentations have outlined this, but this maiden GNU MTBPS and this revised fiscal framework finds our country and the world at large in a state of polycrisis. So we have seen the phenomena of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer all over the world, but it is particularly devastating in a country like South Africa, which is marked by some of the worst inequality in the world. So leading up to the elections, there are political parties who now form part of the GNU who had made commitments to their constituencies, and then the GNU as a government had made specific commitments, notably inclusive growth, reforms to education and healthcare, improved service delivery, and poverty alleviation. However, we are deeply concerned that if the MTBPS is anything to go by, it reflects a commitment to the status quo, which undermines the promises that have been made and risks it just being lip service and rhetoric. There have been education reforms that have been proposed, notably the Bella Act, but our concern is that will these be delivered upon when education sector, the public education sector has been underfunded and continues to be defunded as proposed in the MTBPS. This extends also to healthcare reforms. As we know, the healthcare system is grossly underfunded in the country, where you have clinics that are still made of inappropriate materials. There's still backlogs that have been worsened, or even, some will say created by the fiscal austerity that government has been committed to. And then, of course, we are not sure how service delivery can actually quality service delivery can be delivered upon when there are no resources and service delivery funding has been eroded to deliver these promised services. And so we recommend that Parliament pushes National Treasury to explore fiscal expansion alternatives. So there have been examples in the past, so just using the Jafekra example as one, but really to call for raising economic growth and fiscal expansion rather than uncreative manners such as budget cuts, which really it is the most marginalized people in this country who disproportionately bear this the burden or the impact of this. We continue to call for participatory human rights impact assessments, because this could give the state a better idea, a better position, could be in a better position to really understand what budget decisions, the implication of budget decisions, what they have on our human rights obligations in our country. We really call for Parliament to place pressure on National Treasury in its delaying of the implementation of gender responsive budgeting. This committee had made the recommendation to the National Treasury to implement gender responsive budgeting, but they keep postponing it every year, citing data struggles, which we'll get into in our presentation. We continue to call for reversal of austerity measures, rather seeing that we need to invest in human rights and at minimum inflation linked, but really also to match the growing demand and to really redress some of the issues and the backlogs that are faced in the public sector. And then, of course, what is really important to us is investment in capacity building interventions and other interventions like consequence management to counter the chronic underspending that obstructs the human rights fulfillment in our country. So our analysis of the revised fiscal framework is that, firstly, it is a commitment to the fiscal consolidation. So despite the concerns over human rights impacts and limited economic growth potential, government maintains austerity-focused fiscal consolidation. This MTBPS in fact highlights that the reduction in growth and revenue projections and debt servicing costs continue to rise. But despite that, government is still committed to this austerity, this austerity framework, which is deeply concerning for our coalition. We've seen that there are spending reduction plans that aim to cut main spending over the medium term, and these cuts persist in critical areas of education, social protection. I mean, even post-school education and training, we're seeing issues with NSFAS, and a big part of those issues is because of the budget cuts that have been proposed to that. And then moving on to the revenue performance and outlook that was reflected on. So we are reviewing reviewing the MTBPS and the revised fiscal framework. It is clear more that we really do need to be introducing taxes on the on wealth and financial transactions to reduce inequality and raise additional revenue. High income earners in our country continue to benefit from tax breaks, while the more impoverished people in our country continue to bear the burden of this weak economic climate. We're also concerned that our tax to GDP ratio remains capped below 25% below apartheid, showing that there are low overall tax levels that disproportionately benefit affluent groups, disadvantaging the majority. This is very clear that we need a more progressive tax system in our country, and our fiscal policy has actually been criticized by international bodies, including the UN, experts from the UN, for being, for not utilizing its redistributive capacity. And now more than ever, do we see a need for urgency in redressing this? So this also extends to SARS. So we've seen that SARS has been allocated 2 billion rand over the medium term, which is inadequate for achieving compliance improvements, and will likely continue exacerbate the issues that we have with tax evasion and illicit financial flows. However, we do see the G20 as a opportunity to promote an Africa-centered agenda next year, and and recommend that our stance should align with the Africa Group's progressive stance on tax reform rather than the OECD's approach. And this is also because it's not just South Africa that has been struggling with this. Many countries, most of the countries on the continent have been saying the same thing. And so we'd like our government to speak in unity and show the collective struggle that we are facing as a continent regarding illicit financial flows and tax evasion that impacts the people in this on this continent more so. And we really do see the Treasury's current stance on taxing the wealthy and addressing the debt crisis to be contradictory to this push, but also contrasts Brazil's strong leadership on these issues at the G20. So regarding the tax proposals, a continuation. So, I mean, I've spoken already about tax evasion, but just noting that the cases of Christo Visa's tax disputes is just an example of the need to address this tax evasion and profit shifting, because it is the most marginalized people in this country who bear the burden of the failure of the state to be able to address that. And yeah, I think I'll move on from this slide. Sorry, Then the next aspect, which has been covered by other organizations before, but it's to do with the fiscal anchors. So we raise concerns about Treasury's approach to a fiscal anchor plan because we see that it could undermine Parliament's role and constitutional accountability over public spending. And as you see, as we make these presentations, we really value some of the hard-won freedoms, which include parliamentary participation and the power of Parliament in these processes. We also are concerned that this plan would limit has implications for human rights realization, and that there has been insufficient public participation in shaping this. This is more, it seems that it's imposed on the people of this country rather than it being a collective decision as the people of this country. And this, of course, will have a likely outcome of higher unemployment, increased inequality, and slower growth, which is, those are not problems that we can afford to have in our country because we are already struggling with this triple challenge. Then we move on to the public sector wage bill. So the proposal for the early retirement or the incentive for early retirement of public sector employees is one that we criticize because government is still committed to reducing the public sector wage bill, which contradicts the lived experience of people in this country. There is no one who uses public services, who walks into a clinic, or is at a school, who has ever said that we have too many nurses, we have too many teachers in the sector. Rather, the issues are in those sectors is that there's understaffing. And so we're really calling on our fiscal policy to match and reflect the realities that the people of this country are facing. And this early retirement proposal in particular, we're concerned about it because it does also cut off skills transfer, which juniorizes the public sector. So on the one hand, it is a good thing that there may be opportunities for unemployed people, unemployed doctors, nurses, and teachers to enter the public sector, but we can't also do that. On the one hand, we have that gain, but also losing out on important skills from public sector public sector employees who have been in the space for many decades and have, so there's just an issue that it has not been thought out well enough. And we also call for the public sector wage bill to be seen as an investment in fulfilling our constitutional commitments and not a financial burden. So moving on to gender responsive budgeting. So I'd already reflected at the beginning that Treasury has been delaying gender responsive budgeting inculcation since 2022-23, citing data struggles. And this is an issue because currently the current fiscal framework has a disproportionate impact on women in this country. For example, our public sector wage bill commitment to cutting it is in a context where 70% of teachers are women and over 90% of nurses are women. And of course, and then there's also that gender responsive budgeting is vital for economic empowerment, for improved public service delivery, and to combat gender-based violence. We also call on Yeah, so the historical context is that once upon a time, South Africa was actually the leader for gender responsive budgeting, but now we're lagging behind. Zimbabwe has reflected on gender implications in their budget. Rwanda is far ahead of us in that context, and I think it is time. We think that it's time for South Africa to really do more than pay lip service to the women in this country. I mean, we've already spoken on the impact of austerity on women, but this policy neglects gender equity and it undermines our commitments to a non-sexist and fair society. Moving on to expenditure trends. So this will just be a summary to say that education investment, there's been a slight reduction which undermines the commitment to education reforms, impacting essential resources, school infrastructure, backlogs in redressing unsafe facilities, but also contradicts the commitment to education reforms in the form of the Bella Act. This criticism extends to health investment because while there has been a modest increase of 0.8% to our healthcare system, South Africa's healthcare system remains deeply under-resourced and overcrowded facilities and limited access to quality services. And so there's a juxtaposition of that with the intentions to scale universal healthcare coverage. We're also concerned that there are delays in the implementation of phase 5 of the presidential employment stimulus, and this is deeply concerning in a context where youth unemployment it continues to persist in our country, and shows there's an urgent need for long-term investment and scaling of public employment programs similar to what previous speakers have already alluded to. And again, we're also concerned that there is no way forward regarding the SRD grant. The 21 billion reduction in social grants signals the end of this, which is without a replacement, which is concerning. And previous speakers have also reflected on the digital-only grant applications exclude many in our country from benefiting from this program because of infrastructure and literacy barriers. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, JC. The next item is for members to ask questions and or make comments. Let me share the screen. There we are. Let me note the members who want to make inputs or ask questions. I see Honorable Beasley. Okay. Honorable Beasley, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So I've just got a couple of questions for the presenters. First of all, thank you everybody for their presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed every single one of them. And just to note to COSATU, ARDC and BJC, they're concerned about fiscal consolidation, but my concern, from an Action SA perspective, is that we've spent so much money, government debt, and we've got nothing to show for it. So my concern is if we keep on incurring more debt, are we not just going to leave a worse legacy for future generations? And the problem is current generations are paying for the sins of SAE bailouts and all of that type of stuff. And is it just not a concern that if we don't limit government debt, that we can continue to incur money with nothing to actually show for it and leaving a nasty legacy for future generations? So that's my big concern, and Action SA's big concern about the debt is if we carry on incurring debt, we might actually have nothing to show for it. And that leaves a nasty legacy. And then also the three presenters I referred to SARS being underfunded. And Chair, I think this is a big area. I mean, we've all come from different political thinking ideology, but every single person to the point agrees that SARS is underfunded. And ARDC put it very succinctly when they said it's difficult to understand why the underfunding of SARS continues. And I think that's a question we need to ask. Why does it continue? because it's the guys who've got lots of money who can evade tax, get away with it, but the middle class people are the people paying it, the honest people. And I think it's an area that we need to definitely tackle is the underfunding of SARS. And then just in terms of HHL and Amandla Modi, in terms of the levy on sugar, are they not concerned that we're driving the illegal industry? And we just see what's happening in the spaza shops at the moment, because illicit trade at the moment is just getting out of hand. And the more that we put taxes on, the more we're driving illegal business. So I just get their thoughts on it, because obviously they're quite close to it. What are their thoughts of the health levy driving illegal business? Because at the moment it's happening in the alcohol and the tobacco industry. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Siwisa.
Thank you, Chairperson. Greetings to everyone. I hope my network is not going to fail me, Chair. Chair, I've got only one question, and my apologies for not opening the video due to the bad network connection. I've got only one question, Chair, of clarity, which is directed to COSATU. They've highlighted that even though population grows, but unemployment also increases as the population grows. At the moment, we are standing at 70,000 unfilled posts. Which sectors is it speaking to, number one? Number two, as a trade union, what interventions did they try to make with government to ensure that the unemployment rate is actually 24? We had 1 million servants or employees. In 2024, we only increased was 0.2 million employees or servants, which speaks to the issue that unemployment rate is very high. So as a trade union, what interventions did they try to make between 1994 and 2024 to ensure that actually there is an increase in employment and a decrease in unemployment in the country? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Honorable Van Rooyen.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and very good morning to all. Chair, maybe let me start by welcoming the presentation or submissions made by various stakeholders. Listening to most of the presentation, Chair, obviously what came out quite strongly to me is the iterations and banal submissions that have been made over time. So it's easy for one to conclude that the submissions of most of the presenters seems not to be taken into consideration, because these are not new submissions. So it's easy for one to conclude that it seems as if they are falling on deaf ears, or maybe the mechanism, the participation, public participation mechanism that is currently used is not effective to ensure that their submissions are accommodated when decisions are taken by government. I want to hear their view on the efficacy and the effectiveness of this process. Is it just a formality process where boxes are ticked so as we continue to be rated as a government that is taking submissions from the people or participation of our people seriously? If maybe one can hear what's their take about the effectiveness and the efficacy of this particular participatory model that we are currently using. I think that will help also to us as people who are charged with the responsibility of overseeing the executive as to whether the mechanisms that we are using are really yielding the required results. And there was a presentation, Chair, I just forgot the name of the institution, where the presenter indicated that firstly, there is a lot of fake presenters who come to these sessions without appropriate credentials. Well, I agree. I fully agree with that because in South Africa, there's a tendency of people being assigned titles. Some analysts, some you don't know how do they get these particular titles. But now the question is, we are in a participatory democracy system. Everyone is allowed to engage with us as the parliament of the day, or maybe as representatives, public representatives. Obviously, that suggests that we shouldn't discriminate, but also we should also be careful of people who take advantage of various constituencies, more especially you have vulnerable constituencies. So I would like to know, is there any suggestion from the presenter on how can we deal with this phenomenon of the so-called fake presenters, you know? And then he also made mention of the Parliament Budget Office and the FFC not doing more in as far as taking advantage or leveraging on the information that is shared or can be shared by National Treasury. Maybe if we can get the details of what more can be done by the two institutions, I mean, in relation to what they are currently doing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Honorable Mulife. Honorable Mulife, are you there? Okay, I'll come back to him. Honorable Ryder.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairperson. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say today, Chair. I just want to thank the people that have taken the time to put presentations and ideas together for the committees. Certainly, it enriches the discussion. I want to again making some very thought-provoking submissions. And I do think his submission on the timeframes is certainly valid. It's something that we've spoken about in the past. And perhaps that as joint committees, we need to reconsider the program and how best we can fit it in. Of course, ensuring that the timeframes for the processing of the bills is I do think that there's more work that needs to happen, perhaps behind the scenes. And certainly as the House Chair of Committees in the NCOP, I will take a look and see how we can perhaps look at extending the timeframes while still keeping them realistic, noting that the body of work that has to happen through this. On the other hand, as well, just as a response to Dr. Miller, I do think there's a built into the system. You know, one doesn't need to wait for the adverts to come out to know that there is going to be a public participation process. But his point is well made and well taken as well. So thank you for that. I also want to highlight another point that he brought up is that the fact that modeling is often not well demonstrated, and he quite rightly said it makes it difficult for MPs to make their decisions. Are hopefully being done. If they aren't being done, they certainly should be. And it would be helpful, certainly, to have more transparency in terms of the modeling that underlines the decisions that are made in the longer term proposals. And whilst that may, you know, affect the fiscal policy, certainly even more so it impacts the issues that to start addressing through our committee work as well. Then just a last comment, Chair. Hila, by your own admission, the sugar tax, as it's called, the health promotions levy, is working. It's starting to change behavior, you know, so I think by your own admission, what's in place already is working pretty well. So perhaps argue against yourself when you say that this levy should be increased aggressively. And frankly, the National Council of Provinces underwent a process of taking Parliament to the people. We went to KwaZulu-Natal and we saw directly the impacts. And it's certainly not on the big sugar farmers that the biggest impact comes in. It's on the real small scale and subsistence farmers. We had many people approaching us when we were down in KwaZulu-Natal, talking to us about the real impacts that the sugar levy has had on their lifestyle and livelihoods. And so whilst I think that the objects of the levy are sound, I do think that balance is important, and balance in all things is kind of ideas and ideologies, but certainly I think taking a measured approach to this would be far more constructive. So Hila, I note your issues, and I do think we need to be a little more measured than as overtly aggressive that you're proposing. But yeah, again, many other thought-provoking inputs, which we will take into account in the processing of the bills. Thank you very much, and the policy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Honorable Mauta.
Thank you very much, Chair, and greetings to the colleagues. Chair, I'm largely covered by Honorable Sibisa, but I just want to take a bite on COSATU and HEALA. But before I do that, Chair, I must say that the overwhelming majority of the presenters today, they all agree that the medium-term budget policy statement presented by the minister doesn't really give hope to the hopeless masses of our people. It's a continuation of the austerity measures that have not seen the economic growth, that have not led to the levels of inequalities being brought down, unemployment being kept, and poverty levels also being brought down. So I think all of them, they are in their presentation is that statement has not given clarity on that. And what is more painful is that with this government of national unity, you'd have thought that the political heads from different political school of thoughts and ideas would have come together and really realized that 30 years down the line, the system has not worked, and therefore let's look at a different alternative. So it has not come out. Now, to COSATU, the minister in his presentation, he mentioned that one of the cost-cutting mechanisms he wants to use is to align the headcounts to the budget per department. So if, for example, your budget in the department is, let's say, 15 billion, and therefore it should say you need this headcount, which will see a lot of people being recruited to exit the system to align. Shouldn't that be a worry to you as a trade union that is fighting for the people, for the workers in the main, that things have now changed? I mean, you look at the education department, there's a big issue about the teacher to learner ratio. You look at the nurses, you look at the police, which this high crime rate in the country, and the police, the shortage of police on the streets, the men in blue uniform on the street. And then the minister comes and says, we'll actually align it, because the reality is that there is not enough money allocated to those essential services. And the doctors in hospitals, I mean, I come from a village where the clinic opens between 8 and 4, purely because the department doesn't have money to operate full optimally at 24 hours with full staff complement. And you get told that it will have to be aligned, meaning there'll be more job losses. So shouldn't that be a worry? And what's your response to that? And Chair, on slide 14, which goes into 15 of COSATU, they say they request a halt in cutting the presidential employment stimulus, and it must be expanded to accommodate 2 million young people annually. That's slide 14. But slide 15, it says the presidential employment stimulus must accommodate 1 million participants annually. So which one is which? Is it 2 million? Is it 1 million? What are you advocating for? Or are you saying you're starting with 1 million, ramping up to 2 million in November 2025? Is that what you are saying? Because in the presentation here, it's not very clear what you're saying. And then, Chair, lastly on HELA, we hear you and we fully agree with you, but we don't seem to get your proposal on what the minister should have addressed or should address going into the budget speech of next year, as this is a preparation for budget speech for next year. You spoke about the communicable diseases, you spoke about all these diseases that are due to sugar, intake of sugar, diabetes, and all of them, and how they will actually hit the fiscals very hard if they are not contained. But you're not saying these are the proposals that I'm putting on the table to try to address that issue so that we move from being a recovery, but into being a preventative mode. So if you go to Cuba, the model of Cuba is to prevent sickness. As we fall sick first and we seek to cure the sickness after it has happened. So I think that is what we're trying to address, to say, let's be a government that promote preventative measures instead of people falling sick and then coming to burden the government by going to get sugar diabetes tablets and all of those. But I didn't quite get that from your presentation. With that said, Chair, I thank you very much.
Thanks. Honorable Khadel.
No, thank you, Honorable Chairperson. Good evening, everyone on the platform. I know that on your side it is the morning. I'm sorry for the confusion. So, first of all, Chair, I'd really like to appreciate the presentations made by the various stakeholders in this public hearing. But what is very important here is that we, as the parliamentarians, we've got a duty to listen to the stakeholders, also at the same time, to listen and influence the budget where it is necessary. But I'd like to raise it to all the stakeholders who are here, in particular, the stakeholders which are agitating that there must be, the budget must be increased. The budget must be increased, in particular, to deal with this issue of BIG, to deal with these issues. But what I want to highlight is that we already have more than 28 million people who are on social grants. And then at the same time, we have the taxpayers which are less than 10 million. How do they think that in moving forward we are going to sustain that? And then what I'd also like to agree with them is the issue of under the National Treasury not taxing the private sector enough. Because when you look at the taxation brackets, what happens here is that what is being taxed is far lower than what the other countries are doing. But at the same time, we give them leeway to expropriate their profits outside the country instead of reinvesting in the country. And then also, I like to raise the issue of I agree with COSATU that when coming to the issue of dealing with the state-owned entities, because no country in the world has prospered properly without a significant contribution from the side of the state. So the state usually contributes through the SOEs. I'll agree with COSATU when he says that the issue of Transnet, the TANEL, and SARS and all the other SOEs, they must be supported so that they can be able to fulfill their constitutional mandate. But what is also critical is that to all the stakeholders here, is that as South Africa really is a very small economy which is very open. What are they suggesting that we don't fall into a debt trap? Because the more we spend without adequate income coming in, we might find ourselves in a fiscal cliff, whereby we'll end up in a worse situation, whereby before we pass our budget, we'll have to take a begging bowl to Washington. I think that there's no one who wants that, but I wanted them to suggest to the government, and even to us, how can that thing be avoided? Because when you go to countries like Japan, it's very easy. Their debt to GDP ratio is very high, but they are protected by their friends in the West. We don't experience the same, we don't have the same cushion as South Africa. So what are they suggesting to help the state so that it does not go overboard? Because as they say that this issue of emphasizing the budget surplus, I thought that the budget surplus was issue of cautioning ourselves as a country that we don't fall into deeper and deeper into the debt trap. So I really appreciate even our stakeholders to give suggestion what must be done. Thank you, Chair. I'm in Australia is in the evening here, but I could not avoid not to join this meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Bungan. Last, Honorable Bateman.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, thank you to all of the presenters, and appreciate the research and time and effort that's gone into doing the presentations. I think many of the submissions have highlighted the pain that is caused through budget cuts, and that's been the focus of the attention, and the way that obviously can contribute towards unemployment, poverty, and inequality. But I think perhaps not enough attention has been given to the GNU's commitment to addressing poverty, inequality, and unemployment. But it's more a disagreement about how we do that, rather than whether or not it's important to do it and how we do it. So there's no negotiation about whether it's important. It is certainly important. The question is how to go about that. And I think, as the previous speaker, Honorable Radebe, was saying, the current debt levels that we have, we believe, are not sustainable, and the deficit levels are not sustainable. And that actually, if we continue on our current trajectory, we'll actually end up with far greater poverty, inequality, and unemployment and suffering. And so, as painful as the cuts are, they're actually necessary to avoid greater pain. And I think what's perhaps missing for me is a clear pathway towards growth. Where do we find the growth that we're looking for? And some of the representations have spoken about how the cuts are hindering towards growth, and obviously in the short term that is true. But sometimes, we need to have painful surgery to get ourselves through a malady that it could actually kill us, and yet still we need to do the surgery because that's the route to health. And in our case, how do we address poverty, inequality, and unemployment? And the answer must be through economic growth, and economic growth is driven through direct private sector investment. And I think for me, the one maybe feature of some of the presentations that was missing was just really focusing in on that question, like how do we make South Africa grow and advance in the area of direct private sector investment? And without going into too much detail, for me, in my understanding, some of the keys to that are the boosting of domestic savings, the boosting of corporate profits, and then the winning of the trust and the confidence of investors to invest in South Africa, whether that money is being generated in South Africa or whether it's being generated overseas and then brought to the country. Most of it would tend to be savings and profits that are generated in South Africa. And so we have to start building a capital base, building a wealth base within South Africa. And as that grows, the economy will grow and the employment rate levels will grow and poverty will be addressed, inequality will be addressed. And of course, tax revenues will also start to increase. But we've got ourselves into this place where we have large debt, crowding out public sector priorities, and just unaffordable and approaching a cliff as well. And so that's why these painful measures have been necessary. And we have to look closely at how do we win the trust and the confidence of investors. And there we need to look very closely at our international competitiveness and also what kind of supporting infrastructure is needed to make South Africa a highly investable destination. Unfortunately, because of the lack of trust in government, I think most investors have been rather cautious about directing real direct investment into South Africa because it seems like the government can't control its spending. But I trust that the current GNU arrangement and the budgeting decisions that are being made now are going to get the attention of the investor community to see actually South Africa is really serious about making whatever painful changes are necessary to make sure that South Africa is actually a safe and a stable destination to invest in. So, what I do really appreciate and thank all of the contributions that have been made. I think if I can give a little bit of feedback, I would love to see a bit more emphasis on how we can stimulate economic growth, rather than simply just looking at the spending side and the cuts on the spending side as being painful. Of course they are. We realize that. The question is, how do we grow? How do we create those jobs? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Let's invite the stakeholders. I'll go in terms of the pattern on the program. Each stakeholder is allocated 2 minutes to respond. Kosato, 2 minutes.
No, thanks, Chair. No, thanks, members. Look, I think first, Chair, the fundamental issue where we disagree with Treasury, and we agree with the need to manage the debt, etc. But it's about what is the most sustainable path? Is it one of simply cutting expenditure and hoping for miracles, which has been tried and has not succeeded for some time? Or is it about fixing the state to ensure we have reliable and affordable electricity, fixing freight rails so our export sectors can get their goods to their markets, fixing our ports, our municipalities, resourcing our law enforcement institutions to deal with corruption and wasteful expenditure, investing in home affairs and other public service frontline services to make sure the economy has the goods the state requires. I think for us, that's the difference. We think we need to fix the state because that's going to help grow the economy. I think the approach of simply just cutting expenditure and hoping things will improve, we feel is actually going to make things worse. And yes, we agree, you can't just print money and spend it. That's why we also think let's give support to SARS because there's money owed to the state. We need to boost tax compliance because that will also help ensure the state's got the funds it needs to fund public services, to reduce the debt, to stimulate the economy, etc. We do need to spend much more attention around making sure that the infrastructure program is spent. But I think whilst we grow the economy, we've got to give some relief to the poor and to the unemployed because what happened in July 2021 can happen again anytime. And that's why we think the presidential promise should be expanded to accommodate at least 1 million people by the budget in February, 2 million persons by the MTPS next year. And yes, in the longer term, as Honorable Khadabe says, you need to reverse the ratio of persons who are working, 60 million, to those who have social grants, 27 million. But in the meantime, we do need to deal with these issues. We think, Chair, there's one thing that Parliament should be pushing really is around the presidential employment program, SARS as well. And on the vacancy front too, we think there are critical frontline services like home affairs, teachers, police, nurses, where there's a return on investment if you fill those vacancies. And so again, society benefits from those. Chair, I think to Honorable, I want to just galloping, perhaps one can also do a further written submission to do justice to members' questions. We think there is value in public participation. We have seen on many fronts, from the SOD grant to the two-part pension reforms, the minimum wage, the COVID TERS, the ESCOM debt. But of course, we do think there is a space and a need for Parliament also to put more pressure on the state around key things like the presidential employment program, SARS, corruption, fixing local government, etc. We do need to find the common solutions, as Honorable Ryder says, and I think there is space for us to do it. I think, Chair, just lastly to Honorable Moate, we do have some concerns around early retirement proposals. We think that needs to be engaged with the PSCBC to ensure that if people leave, that we do fill those vacancies. But we are fearful that Treasury might offer early retirement, and we may come back to regret it later, like happened when teachers were offered VSPs in the 90s. And you've seen it as Denel in Transnet, where government has actually gone to recruit people who left those institutions, and even more recently at the police. But we think, Chair, look, fundamentally, all of these issues, we're not going to address them with the economy. Thanks, Chair. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. IEJ.
Thanks, Chairperson and honorable members for the questions and interactions. I think, yeah, in line with what has been touched on by Sabsi, I think the key issue that we emphasize in our proposals is that the path that has been chosen by the National Treasury in terms of addressing the debt issue is harmful, not only to economic growth, which we all agree is fundamental, but also to resource in public services. And I think it's important to emphasize that this is not a short-term measure that we need to sort of like ask everyone in the country to bear with, but it has long-term economic and social consequences, such as the social instability we saw in July 2021. And so I think it's the role of the committee to actually ask National Treasury for human rights impact assessments on the part of the fiscal strategy that it has chosen to pursue, and those that should be presented before this committee, given the overwhelming convergence by all stakeholders who presented here on the negative impacts of the chosen method of addressing the debt issue. But I think it's also key to emphasize that it's not necessarily the quantum of our debt or debt to GDP ratio that is the challenge. And of course, we are concerned with its trajectory, but I think the essential thing that we need to address is the interest payments that we've been paying on this debt. And I think in that regard, it's important to emphasize that it's due to several risks. Some of them are international, some of them are local, related to, for instance, load shedding, the growth path that we have, low growth, as well as the social instability that we have in the country that contributes to driving these interest rates, and then also the role of the South African Reserve Bank in hiking interest rates needs to be carefully considered, and whether this is a sustainable strategy to address inflation, and if it's the right tool even. And so, yeah, that's to emphasize that we agree that the debt should be addressed, but measures to reduce the cost of debt should also be seriously considered. Some may lie in the intervention of monetary policy, for instance, in reducing and purchasing government bonds so that they can be redirected to key sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing, such as construction, in driving long-term economic growth.
Hello.
Yes, Chair.
Thanks very much. Pep.
Thank you, Honourable Chairperson and Honourable Members. So, Honourable Chairperson, we've noted that the fiscal path that South Africa is pursuing is going to remain a headwind for the country and will at the same time result in a permanent reduction in the size of the state. Now, this, be that as it may, as the path that has been pursued since the last decade at the very least, as government has tried to consolidate finances, it has clear implications in terms of the impact on education, basic education, healthcare, policing, and the impact we reiterate needs to be estimated by government, and what alternate plans are being made to change or modify service delivery methods or approaches to service delivery. I think that needs to be a bit more explicit in the national discussion in the context of GNU, because there's no cost-free path that's pursued. So we need that to be more explicit. We, as the Parliament, as the Public Economy Project, differ from Treasury in terms of our outlook over the medium term. We don't foresee this debt stabilizing primary balance being achieved by the outer year or even the second year of the MTEF. And I think there will have to be further adjustments made in the upcoming budget that more accurately reflect some of the underlying pressures that have not been addressed. And these expenditure pressures, if you look at our presentation, have not been addressed for some time, and they're brewing under the surface. And this is part of the challenge that this new GNU has to proceed with. We've also noted that, and Treasury has to some extent stated that more clarity will be provided coming the budget February or March next year, but more clarity on the fiscal anchor and its implications and also its limitations to result in a stabilizing debt path. At the same time, this must not have debilitating effects on the overall objectives of the state. And we look forward to further engagements with the committee, and thank you for your time.
Thanks. AIDC.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the concerns around debt. What we have said in the presentation is that we want to, we recommend that debt is addressed through increasing the tax to GDP ratio. There's an unequal burden placed on expenditure, and because tax to GDP has remained at about 25% in the past few decades, we believe that this should be further tapped into, and we gave some recommendations in our presentation around that. We also note that even through the tracing of a primary budget surplus, debt service costs have increased. So we are questioning whether austerity is the way, because it's not that we need to, debt is a problem because the servicing costs then will outpace spending in healthcare, education, and social protection. But then if we have austerity, but those costs, but there's still upward revisions to those debt servicing costs, then austerity and fiscal consolidation is not achieving what it's intending to. We also want to note that so there was a point about we can't show progress or impact with increased spending. And this isn't necessarily a result only because of that increased spending does not lead to more economic growth, but rather because of other factors like tremendous structural constraints, but also corruption and global economic conditions like the COVID-19 pandemic. But corruption in itself is not a reason to withdraw spending in healthcare, education, and social protection. That won't address the issue of corruption or of and I also wanted to just talk about this point about economic growth. The claim that economic growth is driven by direct private sector investment from, I think, the last MP. This depends on the nature of the growth. So it could result in profits being shifted to the elites, combined with wage evasion. We can see during the in the revised PIT estimates that there's actually a decline in this, and this could be a result of salaries not increasing in line with inflation in the private sector, as an example. We can't have a situation of jobless growth or of growth of economic growth which does not result in increased wages. There's an emphasis on infrastructure, and there's some stuff being stated in the MTBPS around the construction industry and job creation, and how 1 million rand leads to 3 jobs in construction. But we are concerned that some of the jobs in construction are precarious, meaning short term, meaning that this is not a reliable and sustainable form of income. So we also just want to know that privatization can also increase costs for the user of the service, which turns rights holding citizens into clientele. So ultimately we're saying that cuts in government spending undermine growth. It's not just about the pain caused, but it's also about the loss in public employment that has spillover effects. And we are recommending that investment in public and social infrastructure is the path to take. Thank you.
Thanks, Alia. Dr. Muller.
Thank you, Honourable Chairperson. I think I just have some questions and comments from Honourable Van Rooyen and Honourable Ryder to address. The first one was about, in the phrasing used, fake presenters and how to deal with that issue. So I just want to clarify on that. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting anybody's fake, but what I'm suggesting is that presenters come to Parliament suggesting that they are presenting in a certain kind of capacity, and that is misleading. Let me take an example. I've always presented to these committees since I left the Parliamentary Budget Office. I presented in my individual capacity as an expert, and I've even had to correct sometimes PMG members and staff members who put down University of Johannesburg. I don't represent the University of Johannesburg. I'm an academic at or affiliated to. These kinds of distinctions are important. But for example, if I create an organization, say a nonprofit, and I get some grant funding, I can, I could just call it the National Economy Project. And then I come to Parliament, and maybe I employ some people with that grant money. Then I can get my ideas brought to Parliament as the National Economy Project, no longer as an individual. But the truth is, I'll still be signing off on those. Those will ultimately still be my view. So what has really changed? Nothing, except that I've created an organization and gotten some grant funding and employed some people with that. I don't represent anybody any more than I did, and I don't have any additional technical credibility beyond what I did before. But now my status in Parliament is different. Right. So, I mean, it's a bigger discussion. This is not an issue just limited to public finance inputs. It is an issue that is relevant in Parliament and beyond Parliament on other issues. What is civil society? What capacity are people presenting in? So I think a more systematic approach could be taken in Parliament, perhaps using a form that presenters complete before they present, and that could ask questions about who do you represent, who is signing off on the submission, what are your funding sources? For example, I'm just speaking off the cuff here. I can make a more detailed submission, but I think that's something that actually should be taken up by Parliament more broadly. I completely agree with the principle that was mentioned that anybody can come and present to Parliament. So I'm not suggesting that anybody be excluded. What I'm just suggesting is that individuals should be clear about their capacity. And related to that, Honourable Chairperson, is an issue of individuals wearing multiple hats. I am concerned about the fact that one of the organizations that presents to this committee is run by a commissioner of the FFC. I actually do not understand how it's possible for somebody to hold a role within the FFC where they probably have a great deal of influence because of their experience, relevant experience. So they inform the FFC submission that comes to the committees in the last few days, and they inform a separate submission, but it's the same person influencing both of those submissions. That kind of thing worries me a great deal, honourable members, and I really think that it needs to be addressed more systematically. The other, I'm grateful to Honourable Ryder for recognising the issue around timing. Just to say that, yes, it's true that, of course, anybody engaged with these processes should be aware that a call for submissions is going to come. But do bear in mind that there is very little time. So, for example, when I was at the PBO, oftentimes some of us needed to work fully over the weekend, for example, just to put together a vaguely competent submission. National Treasury has months to put together the MTBPS or the budget, and then everybody else has days, really, to put together a response. And that's just too asymmetrical. On the final issue, on the question of what the PBO and the FFC could do better, that's a very big question. The answer is there's a lot they could do better. My view is really that neither institution is fulfilling its mandate. There's been a lot of instability at both, more recently at the FFC, and the way that the instability of the FFC has been resolved is very unsatisfactory. I noticed 2 commissioners have recently been appointed, and I didn't see any public advertisement For that, I guess it must have been gazetted, but it seems to have just been smuggled through very quietly. But the specific point I was making is that both of these institutions, if, for example, Parliament, and for whatever reasons, members might just be busy with other things, perhaps they trust the Treasury more, but both of these institutions have the mandate of critically examining what the Treasury proposes to Parliament and advising Parliament accordingly. Both these institutions have the capacity. Sorry, Honourable Chair, I'm wrapping up. Yes?
Dr. Muller, please conclude.
Yes, I'm concluding. Both these institutions have the capacity to get the kind of information I was talking about from the Treasury. PBO's capacity to do that is legislated, so they could do more in that respect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What comes next? Is it Hila? Yeah, Hila.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. My colleague, Mr. Mazoyaba, has just stepped out, so I'll just quickly take the comments. Firstly, just to thank everyone for this opportunity to participate in the public submissions, and to say, the comment was made that a lot of the submissions relate to budget cuts. So we're very happy to be here talking about excise taxation on health costs that are externalized, which is actually a source of revenue. So just to also flag that. Apologies to the honourable member from Action SA for not getting your surname, but you make a very good point, and we appreciate, as Hila, the nuance that you bring into the conversation about food. So your comment was about concerns with the illegal SSB trade, effectively. We haven't seen any evidence that that is a concern in South Africa, although I can say that definitely we've seen that being flagged in, for example, Ghana and Nigeria. But also perhaps something that is important to note here is that ultimately when we see these cases of children being poisoned, it's usually ultra-processed products. So we see products like polony, which is susceptible to certain diseases like listeria, just using the example we've seen in South Africa, being very susceptible. And we also see that shop owners, in an attempt to increase the perishability of products, would then use toxins to get rid of vermin. So none of that necessarily speaks to an illegal trade. And given that it's major SSB companies who would be still producing those products, that doesn't seem immediately to be a concern. And one of the ways in which the health promotion levy functions effectively is that it allows for reformulation. We want to thank Honourable Moatwe for your comment and your acknowledgement of the dire health crisis we have in South Africa. And just to note that our ask is for a health promotion levy of at least 20%, but of course not to exclude other civil societies asking for tobacco and alcohol taxation, which is equally important. On that note, and on the success and from Honourable Ryder's comment, which was a comment he made in February, and also in terms of the cane growers, our response would be that it would make zero sense to identify that a behavioral intervention is working to remove it. That would be like saying income tax successfully raised taxes and therefore we can now stop. And also what my colleague Mr. Mazoyaba was very clear about in his presentation is that we've seen successful reformulation and we've seen a reduction in sugar intake. We have not seen a reduction in diabetes. So what has changed since that comment was made in February to now is that we've seen the annual rate of diabetes, or the rate of diabetes in South Africa increasing from 3 million South Africans to 4 million. And we very notably see that 400,000 school children have diabetes. So I'll repeat my request to Honourable Ryder that I made in February, which is to say that next time when NCOP does in fact do ground travel, please do, after visiting the cane growers, please pop into Addington Hospital to see one of the more than 2,500 amputations taking place in that province alone. And on the note of the cane growing jobs, just to note that their own organization that represents them has released a study in which it indicates a multiplicity of factors that have led to job losses, which is its own corruption, its failure to diversify, and in fact, elements that are completely outside of the control of anyone, such as drought, and within the control of government, such as poor tariff regulation. So just to take those notes and to thank everyone for having me.
Thank you. The next stakeholder is Aman Lamobi.
Yes, thank you, Honorable Chair. Thank you for the comment. I think what I would like to speak on is on Honorable Khadebe's comment about, the taxpayer to social grants recipients ratio for the BIG. I think, Honorable Chair, we are way past the topic of whether we can afford a BIG or not. There's been extensive research by multiple people, multiple organizations, multiple economists that show that South Africa can afford a basic income grant, and that some of the ways to fund that could be, through taxing the wealthy, increasing tax compliance, taxing the private sector to raise enough revenue to fund the basic income grant. But more than that, Honorable Chair, I think we are at a point where we have seen that the government agrees that South Africa needs a basic income grant. So it's no longer a question of whether we can afford it or not. It's a question of when is it going to happen, because it has been promised. And we know that the state is very capable of implementing such an intervention. We have seen it with the SRD grant. And so, we are at a point where it needs to happen, and we just need to know when is it going to happen. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. And the last stakeholder, BJC.
Right, thank you. So I think our contributions will probably be have already been covered by most of the previous speakers, but I think something that we're concerned about is one of the comments that honorable member made about it being, painful surgery for long-term gain. But this is not a short-term situation. So the government has been undertaking budget cuts and underfunding of social spending areas for the past decade, actually. So, and instead of seeing any form of, there's no short term in that, because instead of seeing any form of even that consolidation of the fiscus, what we're actually seeing is projected even lower growth rates that are projected, even lower tax revenues that are projected, and even higher debt servicing costs. So clearly this isn't working. And it is important that government explores alternative ways of resource mobilization, because it has been impacting the majority of people in this country for long, and also that the painful surgery is not just being had, it's not carried by everyone equally. So not everyone in the country is making a sacrifice. It's actually the most marginalized people who are carrying the burden of that. We know that because, like as said in our presentation, that South Africa's fiscal policy has been criticized for underutilizing its redistributive capacity. So it really does mean that the rich are not shouldering the impact of this, but it really is the majority, the poor majority, the missing middle, and even, the working class who are carrying this. And that's why we've been calling for participatory human rights impact assessments, so that we can redress that kind of situation. So there's an idea, or there's a narrative that's being pushed that there's no other choice but to undertake austere budgeting, but that is simply untrue. And it does, and it's inappropriate to say that in a context where so many people continue to bear the burden of poverty and inequality and unemployment in our country. And I think our fiscal policy does actually need to reflect the realities of the people in our country, the needs of the people in our country, our constitutional obligations, and not just what looks good for the markets. And then also calling for, there are alternatives. We can undertake progressive tax reforms, targeted public investments, looking at our industrial policy, negotiating our debt in such a way that our debt servicing costs don't continue to balloon in the way that they have. And of course, strengthening our social safety, social protection nets is a way to advance inclusive growth. So not just any growth, but a growth that ensures not just jobless growth, but a growth that actually brings in everyone in the country to participate in the economy. So yeah, I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thanks. I hope we have given all the stakeholders an opportunity to respond. From here, now that we are done, with the public hearings. On Friday, Alan Mount was the hand for?
Yeah, no,
it's
thank
on. TG, you can go forward. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Chair. Before you close the meeting, the point that was made by Dr. Muller about the double dipping official, a stakeholder at the same time is an official at FFC. I think it's a matter that we need to take as the committee. We shouldn't allow that. I think it's it's unethical, it's wrong. So I think it's an issue that we should not, we don't need to discuss it here, Chair, but I think in our committee, when we sit and reflect, we need to take it up there. Thank you, Chair. That was all from me. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Muller will have to write to the committee and tell us who's that person and why he thinks she or he is not supposed to make an oral presentation here, because we can't second guess who's the person. Can you write to the committee, Dr. Muller? Please do so in writing. You have Alan and Tebucho's email. Can we move and so that it's 12 o'clock now?
Chair, can I make a request? All unanswered questions, can they be in written form? Because I think my question was not answered pertaining to the intervention of COSAT. So can they be in written form, please, so that we must know what we are dealing with? Thank you.
Comrade Matthew, can you remember the question asked by Honorable Suwesa? He's no longer here. Comrade Matthew, are you there?
I think he left, Chairperson.
Okay. Please talk to him that there is an outstanding question that was not responded to. I understood he had so many questions to respond to. I had to cut him because he had gone beyond 2 minutes. So make a follow-up with him to respond in writing. Thanks very much. We are meeting again. Is it 9 o'clock on Kulek and Alan on Friday?
Yes, it's 9 o'clock on Friday.
Yeah, for Treasury and SARS to come and respond. Thanks very much, honorable members, stakeholders, support teams, everybody who's in the platform. Let's adjourn the meeting and meet again on Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.